Have you ever wondered why you make choices that don't make sense? Why you sometimes doubt yourself even when you're succeeding? Or why tiny decisions shape your entire life without you even realizing it? From the invisible gorilla experiment to imposter syndrome, from the way we compare ourselves to others to the way our emotions trick our judgment, psychology hides secrets that control our lives every single day. And once you see these hidden forces, you'll never look at yourself or the world the same way again. So, stick with me until the end of this video, because what you're about to learn will change the way you think forever. And if you're ready to uncover these truths, make sure to hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it, because today, we're breaking free from the illusions that hold us back. Invisible Gorilla. In '99, psychologists Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabris carried out what would become one of the most famous and eye-opening experiments in modern psychology. They wanted to test something that seems obvious at first glance, but is in fact deeply deceptive: our ability to notice what is right in front of us. They filmed a short, ordinary video. Two groups of people were passing basketballs back and forth. One group wore white shirts, and the other group wore black shirts. Viewers of the video were given a very simple task: count the number of times the players in white shirts passed the ball. That was it. Nothing complicated, nothing tricky. Most viewers leaned in, focused, and did their best to keep track of every pass. But something strange happened in the middle of the video. While the players tossed the ball back and forth, a person dressed head to toe in a big, hairy gorilla suit casually walked into the scene, stopped in the middle, beat their chest, and walked out. You would think that nobody could possibly miss something so obvious. A gorilla in the middle of a basketball game? How could anyone overlook that? And yet, when the experimenters asked afterward, about half of the viewers swore they never saw the gorilla at all. This shocking result reveals something fundamental about the way the human brain works. It's not that the viewers had poor eyesight. It's not that the gorilla was invisible. It was right there in the middle of the screen. The problem was not with their eyes, it was with their attention. Psychologists call this phenomenon inattentional blindness. It happens when we fail to notice something in plain sight because our focus is locked tightly onto something else. In the case of the video, people were so intensely concentrated on counting the passes that their brains filtered out everything unrelated to that task. The brain decided, passes matter, everything else does not, and it literally erased the gorilla from awareness. This demonstrates that our attention works less like a wide-angle camera and more like a narrow spotlight. We think we see everything, but in reality we only see what our spotlight of attention is shining on, and everything outside of that focus can vanish, even a gorilla. The invisible gorilla experiment shook people because it revealed a flaw in our confidence. We often assume that if something unusual happened in front of us, we would surely notice it. But this experiment proved that isn't true. The mind is constantly making choices about what to notice and what to ignore. Imagine driving on a busy street. You're searching for a particular sign or building, and you focus so hard on spotting it that you fail to notice a pedestrian stepping off the curb. Your eyes may have looked directly at them, but because your attention was elsewhere, the image never fully registered in your mind. This is how real-life accidents happen. A driver insists they looked both ways and saw nothing, yet moments later, they hit someone. It isn't that they didn't look, it's that they didn't notice. Their mind filtered the person out. What makes inattentional blindness even more troubling is that it doesn't only apply to vision. It can affect hearing, memory, even touch. A nurse carefully reviewing a patient's chart may completely fail to register the sound of a critical alarm going off in the room. A witness in a courtroom may confidently claim they saw everything clearly, unaware that their focus was elsewhere at the critical moment. In every case, the brain edits reality to fit the task at hand. And because these gaps in awareness are invisible to us, we walk around with the illusion that we are far more observant than we actually are. This illusion of attention has consequences everywhere. In aviation, for example, pilots go through long checklists before takeoff. But if a pilot becomes hyper-focused on one part of the list, they might miss something else just as vital. To counter this, airlines spread responsibility across multiple crew members, ensuring that no single person carries the entire load of attention. In hospitals, nurses divide duties so that while one monitors vital signs, another manages medications, reducing the chances of missing a life or death change. The same lesson applies in classrooms. Students often believe they can multitask, toggling between listening to a lecture and scrolling on their phone. But the brain cannot fully attend to two things at once. It switches rapidly back and forth, and each switch costs precious focus. The student thinks they're absorbing both, but in truth, they're missing important details from both. Inattentional blindness also reshapes our understanding of memory. Many people think memory works like a video camera that records everything we see and hear, but memory only stores what attention selects. If you never noticed the gorilla in the first place, it won't exist in your memory. You can't recall a detail that never entered your awareness. A security guard might stare at a bank of screens all day, but if their attention was fixed on one corner of the video feed, they may later swear nothing happened, even though a thief entered in plain view on another screen. The footage shows it. Their eyes may have looked at it, but their attention never captured it, and so their memory has a blank space. The gap between what we think we notice and what we actually notice can be dangerous. People say things like, "I would have seen that," or "I never miss stuff like that." But the invisible gorilla study proves that even when something is obvious, we can miss it entirely. This mismatch between confidence and reality matters in high-stakes situations like driving, law enforcement, or surgery, where missing a detail could mean catastrophe. The brain often fills in gaps and gives us a false sense of certainty. We believe our awareness is complete. We trust our senses too much. But the truth is, we are blind far more often than we realize. The good news is that awareness of this weakness can help us improve. Simply teaching people about inattentional blindness makes them more cautious. A surgeon who knows they are vulnerable to missing details may double-check their work. A driver may pause before turning, taking one more moment to scan for hidden dangers. Awareness doesn't eliminate the effect, but it creates better habits. The invisible gorilla has also shaped how we view eyewitness testimony. Jurors often assume that a confident witness must be accurate, but confidence does not equal correctness. If someone's attention was focused on one thing, their memory may have holes they don't even realize. They are not lying. They simply never noticed what they now believe they saw. Inattentional blindness is not a rare glitch in the human mind. It is part of how all of our brains function. It is the price of efficiency. Our attention system allows us to survive in a busy world by focusing on what seems most important at the moment. But the trade-off is that we are blind to everything outside that focus. Whether we're crossing a street, reading a chart, driving a car, or even watching a video, we must remember, seeing is not the same as noticing. Sometimes the gorilla really does walk right in front of us, pounds its chest, and strolls away, and we never even know it happened. Misinformation Effect. In 1974, psychologists Elizabeth Loftus and John Palmer conducted a study that revealed a disturbing truth about memory. It is not the reliable recorder we believe it to be. Instead, memory can be shaped, distorted, and even rewritten by the words we hear and the information we are given after an event. To demonstrate this, Loftus and Palmer showed participants a short film of a car accident. After watching, they asked a simple question: how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? For some groups, however, the word hit was replaced with stronger words like smashed, collided, bumped, or contacted. The results were striking. Those who heard the word smashed gave higher speed estimates than those who heard hit. A single word changed how people remembered the same event. Even more shocking, many participants who heard smashed later recalled seeing broken glass in the video, even though none existed. Their memory had created details to fit the language. This became known as the Misinformation Effect, when misleading information introduced after an event changes a person's memory of it. What makes the Misinformation Effect so powerful is that people are usually unaware it has influenced them. They believe their memory is accurate, they feel confident, but their confidence does not equal truth. Memory does not work like a video camera, faithfully replaying what was recorded. Instead, memory works like a puzzle that the brain reconstructs each time we recall it. And when new pieces are introduced through suggestion, language, or leading questions, our minds often insert them into the puzzle as if they were always there. This explains why two people can witness the same event and later give entirely different accounts, both believing deeply that they are correct. Consider how this plays out in everyday life. A child might see a dog bark once, Later, if someone asks, "Did the dog growl at you?" the child might begin to remember the dog as aggressive. Over time, that memory can grow stronger until the child becomes genuinely afraid of dogs, even though the original encounter was harmless. Or imagine a simple conversation between friends. One recalls seeing a red car at the scene of an accident. Another says, "No, I think it was blue." Over time, the first person may begin to doubt their own memory and adopt the blue car version as their own. In both cases, the mind accepts the suggestion and integrates it, unaware that the new detail is false. This vulnerability of memory has enormous consequences in places where accuracy matters most, like courtrooms. Eyewitness testimony is often seen as powerful evidence. Jurors believe that someone who sounds confident must be telling the truth, but Loftus's research proved otherwise. A witness who is questioned with leading language, "Did you see the knife in his hand?" instead of "What did you see?" may later swear they saw a knife, even if one was never present. They are not lying. Their memory has simply been rewritten by suggestion, and once rewritten, it feels as real as any genuine memory. This is why wrongful convictions have occurred in cases where eyewitnesses confidently identified suspects, only for DNA evidence years later to prove them wrong. The misinformation effect shows us that memory is fragile, and confidence is not proof of accuracy. But this effect doesn't just shape big events. It shapes how we remember daily experiences. Think about advertising. When a commercial repeats the same claim, "This product makes you feel happier," or "People everywhere are enjoying it," those repeated suggestions can reshape how you remember your own experiences. You may begin to believe you felt happier using the product, even if you didn't. Repetition and suggestion plant seeds that your memory waters over time. Similarly, if someone tells you often enough that you once enjoyed a certain movie, you may eventually remember enjoying it, even if your first impression was boredom. The brain values a coherent story, even if it has to adjust the past to make that story fit. Loftus and Palmer's study revealed a key truth: memory is reconstructive. Each time we recall an event, we rebuild it. We pull fragments of what we saw, combine them with our current beliefs, add in any suggestions we've heard, and shape the memory into something that feels whole. But this rebuilding means that memory is vulnerable. Like clay, it can be molded. And with each retelling, each new question, each new suggestion, the memory may drift further from reality while feeling more real in our minds. The danger is that we often trust memory more than we should. People insist, "I know what I saw," or "I'll never forget it." Yet the misinformation effect proves that even vivid, confident memories can be false. And when false details are repeated, they become stronger. The more we think about them, the more familiar they feel, and the more we believe they must be true. This explains how entire groups of people can come to share the same false memory, a phenomenon known as the Mandela Effect, where communities vividly recall events or details that never occurred. The misinformation effect is the engine behind these collective illusions. Technology has helped reveal why this happens. Brain imaging shows that when we recall an event and when we imagine one, the same brain regions light up. The brain does not clearly label memories by their source. It remembers the story, but not always where the story came from. Was it something you saw, something you heard, something you imagined? The brain often cannot tell. As a result, imagined details or suggested details can blend seamlessly into the memory, and once blended, they are indistinguishable from reality. The implications are vast. In journalism, how a story is framed can shape what readers remember later. In education, how a teacher words a question can influence what a student recalls. In therapy, the questions asked can unintentionally plant new memories that never happened. In politics, repeated slogans can reshape not only how people see the present, but how they remember the past. The misinformation effect reminds us that language is powerful, not just for persuading, but for rewriting the very fabric of memory. The solution is not to abandon memory, but to approach it with humility. Awareness helps. Police now train officers to avoid leading questions when interviewing witnesses. Instead of asking, "Did you see the gun?" they ask, "What did you see?" Teachers are careful about how they phrase questions so they don't shape answers unintentionally. And ordinary people can practice writing down details quickly after an event, capturing impressions before they can be rewritten. By understanding that memory is not a fixed photograph, but a flexible story, we can protect ourselves from being misled. The The misinformation effect is both unsettling and liberating. Unsettling because it reveals how fragile and unreliable our minds can be. Liberating because it reminds us that memory is not destiny. It can be shaped, questioned, and tested. The past is not set in stone. It lives in the mind, fluid and changing. And sometimes, the most dangerous lies are not the ones others tell us, but the ones our own memory convinces us are true. Change blindness. In '98, psychologists Daniel Simons and Daniel Levin designed an experiment that seemed almost like a magic trick. They wanted to test how much attention people truly pay to the world around them, especially in situations that feel ordinary. The setup was simple. An experimenter would approach a stranger on the street and ask for directions. As the conversation began, two people carrying a large door would walk between them, briefly blocking the view. While the door passed, the original experimenter would quickly step out, and a completely different person, someone with a different face, different clothes, even a different voice, would take his place and continue the conversation as if nothing had happened. Shockingly, many people did not notice the switch at all. They kept talking as if they were still speaking with the same person. This phenomenon is called change blindness, the inability to detect changes in our environment, even when those changes are large and happen right in front of us. It shows just how fragile our perception really is. We like to think of ourselves as highly observant, noticing every detail, but in reality, our minds often construct a stable picture of the world based on assumptions. We see what we expect to see more than what is actually there. When that door blocked the view, people's brains assumed that nothing important would change. And so, when the new person appeared, their minds accepted it without question. Change blindness demonstrates that our attention is extremely selective. At any moment, our eyes take in far more detail than our brain can process. To save energy, the brain filters and fills in gaps with guesses. Imagine looking at a friend across a cafe table. You register their general appearance, face, shirt color, maybe their hairstyle, but you aren't storing every tiny detail. If their shirt changes from light blue to dark blue while you glance away, you might not notice. Your brain assumes consistency unless something dramatic calls your attention to the difference. The invisible switch in the door experiment worked because it violated no expectations. You don't expect someone to literally swap places mid-conversation, so your brain overlooks it. This kind of blindness happens more often than we realize. Movie editors rely on it constantly. In films, small details change between shots. A glass half full in one moment is nearly empty in the next. A character's position might shift slightly from one frame to the other. Most audiences never notice because our brains smooth over the differences. We focus on the story, not the tiny inconsistencies. In daily life, this same smoothing process can have more serious consequences. A witness to a crime might fail to notice that a suspect's clothing changed color, or that a car that was red became blue, if the change happened during a moment of distraction. In hospitals, a nurse might miss an important change on a monitor if the layout stays mostly the same. In airports, security staff may fail to see that a bag has been swapped if the environment looks stable. Why do we miss such obvious changes? One reason is that our brains don't treat every detail as equally important. We prioritize meaning over precision. When you're talking to someone, your focus is on their words, not memorizing their facial features. If they match the general outline you've already formed, average height, male, dark hair, your brain may accept them as the same person even if the details are different. In other words, your brain builds a mental sketch and then defends it, filling in blanks with assumptions rather than updating every detail in real time. Another reason is that social expectations shape what we notice. We don't expect reality to suddenly shift in bizarre ways. If you're helping someone in a store and they duck behind a shelf, you assume the person who reappears is the same. Our brains are wired to assume continuity. To notice a change, the difference has to be dramatic enough to break that continuity. But when a change happens quietly, during a momentary distraction, it often goes unnoticed. Researchers have tested change blindness with flicker experiments. Participants see two nearly identical images that alternate back and forth, separated by a blank screen. A major detail changes between the two, like a building disappearing or a car switching color. Yet people often stare for several seconds without detecting the difference. Their brains are too busy processing the whole scene to focus on the shifting detail. Only when they finally spot the change do they realize how obvious it was. This reveals just how much of our vision is actually assumption and memory filling in the gaps. The consequences of change blindness are not limited to lab experiments. In real life, missing a change can have high stakes. A driver may fail to notice that a traffic light has turned from green to red if they are distracted for just a moment. A pilot might overlook a critical change in instrument readings if the layout looks familiar. A doctor may miss signs of a worsening condition if they are focusing on other details. In each case, the person believes they are paying attention, but their brain, overwhelmed by too much information, simply edits out the change. What makes change blindness even more surprising is that it affects everyone. It's not a matter of intelligence, vision strength, or alertness. Even young, healthy people in broad daylight miss huge changes when their attention is directed elsewhere. People tend to believe they are more observant than they really are. They insist, I would notice if someone switched places in front of me, or I'd catch it if something big disappeared. But experiment after experiment shows otherwise. The mind is not designed to track every detail. Instead, it creates a convincing illusion of stability. We walk around believing we see everything clearly, but what we see is mostly a stitched-together story made from fragments, guesses, and assumptions. Understanding change blindness has practical benefits. Designers of safety systems now highlight changes more boldly, using flashing signals or distinct sounds so that important updates stand out. Pilots and surgeons use strict checklists to prevent missing details their brains might otherwise filter out. Emergency procedures are built to double-check critical steps because relying on memory and observation alone is too risky. Even in everyday life, knowing about change blindness can make us more careful. We learn not to trust our first impression blindly, but to check twice before making decisions. At its core, change blindness is not a flaw, but a trade-off. The brain is efficient. It cannot process every detail, so it filters out what seems unimportant and focuses on what matters most for survival. Most of the time, this works beautifully. We get through life without being overwhelmed by the flood of sensory information. But the cost of this efficiency is blindness to change. We miss more than we realize, even when it happens right before our eyes. The lesson is humbling. We are not the sharp-eyed observers we imagine. Reality is not recorded frame by frame in our minds. Instead, it is constructed moment by moment, held together by attention, expectation, and memory. And sometimes, in that fragile process, a whole person can swap places right in front of us, and we never even notice. False memories. In '95, psychologists Henry Roediger and Kathleen McDermott carried out a study that revealed just how fragile and flexible memory really is. They used a method that became known as the DRM paradigm, named after Deese, Roediger, and McDermott. The experiment was deceptively simple. Participants were shown lists of words that all shared a common theme. For example, a list might include words like bed, pillow, blanket, dream, tired, and nap. After studying the list, people were asked to recall as many words as they could remember. What happened was astonishing. A large number of participants confidently recalled the word sleep, even though it was never actually on the list. They didn't just guess. Many insisted they had seen it, describing their memory of it with complete certainty. Their brains had filled in the missing piece because it fit the pattern. This was the birth of a powerful insight. Memory doesn't just record facts, it actively constructs them, and sometimes it builds things that never happened at all. This effect is what we call false memories. They are not deliberate lies. They are not products of imagination alone. Instead, they are the result of the brain's natural way of connecting ideas, filling gaps, and creating coherent stories. The human mind craves meaning and patterns. When presented with related ideas, it automatically weaves them together. If the word bed calls to mind sleep, the brain may store them side by side, even when one was never presented. Later, when recalling the list, the connection feels so natural that the false detail slips in seamlessly. And because memory is not a perfect replay but a reconstruction, the brain has no way to distinguish the false from the true. To the person remembering, it feels just as real as an authentic memory. Roediger and McDermott's study showed that this is not a rare glitch but a common feature of memory. In fact, about 80% of participants in their research recalled false words at least once, and many rated those memories as highly confident. This is deeply unsettling because it reveals that even our most vivid recollections may not be trustworthy. We like to believe that memory is like a video camera, capturing events as they happen and storing them for later playback. But memory is more like a storyteller. Each time we recall something, we rebuild it, pulling from fragments, knowledge, expectations, and context. And in the process, details can be added, removed, or reshaped without us realizing it. Consider a common example. If someone asks you what you had for breakfast last Sunday, you might not remember the exact meal, but you know your habits. You usually eat toast and coffee, so your brain fills in the blanks and says, toast and coffee. You may be right, but if on that day you actually had cereal, you have just created a false memory. You didn't try to lie, you simply relied on patterns and expectations. The mind prioritizes coherence over accuracy, and in doing so, it sometimes trades truth for consistency. False memories are not limited to small details. They can expand into entire events. In social settings, when one person recalls a story with certain details, others may adopt those details as their own. Over time, the group agrees on a version that never actually happened. This is known as memory conformity. It shows how social influence can reshape individual recollections. Even a simple suggestion, remember when he was wearing a blue jacket, can lead others to recall the jacket as blue, even if it was red. Memory is contagious, spreading from one person to another, rewriting itself along the way. The implications for eyewitness testimony are enormous. A witness may sound confident, but their memory may be partially or entirely false. If they discuss the event with others, hear suggestive questions from lawyers, or replay the scene in their mind, details can shift. A suspect's height, clothing, or even identity can be misremembered, and once the memory takes shape, the witness may defend it with certainty, not realizing it was built on suggestion. This is one reason wrongful convictions have occurred in countless cases, later overturned by DNA evidence. The witnesses were not lying. They were remembering, but remembering wrongly. The DRM paradigm helps explain why. Words and ideas are stored in networks in the brain. Related concepts sit close together. When one is triggered, others nearby light up as well. Think about the word doctor. It may trigger nurse, hospital, medicine, or patient. In the original DRM experiment, the word sleep was so strongly linked to the other words in the list that the brain treated it as part of the memory. This shows that memory works by association, but association can mislead. The stronger the web of connections, the more likely a false piece will sneak in unnoticed. This isn't limited to word lists. Children are particularly vulnerable to false memories when asked leading questions. A child who is repeatedly asked, "Did someone touch you during the exam?" may eventually begin to believe it happened, even if it didn't. Their minds connect the repeated suggestion with the context of the doctor and build a memory that feels real. Repetition strengthens the illusion. The more often a detail is rehearsed, the more familiar it feels. Familiarity, in turn, is mistaken for truth. Advertising uses this principle too. A commercial that repeatedly pairs a product with images of joy, friends, and fun can lead consumers to remember Enjo, buying the product in ways they never did. The brain links the product with positive emotions and, over time, forms a memory of experience that fits the story, even if no such experience occurred. Similarly, political propaganda can implant false memories of events that never happened, or rewrite the emotional tone of real events. Repeated often enough, the suggestion becomes indistinguishable from genuine memory. Neuroscience provides insight into why this happens. Brain scans show that recalling an event and imagining an event activate many of the same brain regions. The brain does not label memories with tags like real or imagined. Instead, it stores the content of the memory. Later, when recalling it, the brain doesn't necessarily remember where the memory came from. Was it seen? Was it suggested? Was it imagined? The brain treats them all similarly. This is why false memories can feel as vivid and real as authentic ones. Roediger and McDermott's work also showed that even when people are warned about the possibility of false memories, the effect persists. Participants told to be careful still recalled words that were never shown. This reveals how deeply memory relies on meaning rather than exact detail. We remember the general sense or gist of things, but we lose track of the precise pieces, and it's in those missing details that false memories sneak in. False memories are not rare accidents. They are an inherent part of how the brain works. Our minds prioritize efficiency, coherence, and meaning. This allows us to respond quickly to the world and to function in complex situations. but the trade-off is that our memories can be wrong without us ever realizing it. What feels certain may be false. What feels undeniable may never have happened. The lesson is not to distrust all memory, but to recognize its limits. Memory is powerful, but it is not perfect. It is a living process, always under construction, always vulnerable to suggestion, always shaped by context and expectation. From courtrooms to conversations, from childhood recollections to advertisements, false memories remind us that the past we carry in our minds is not a fixed record. It is a story, constantly retold, sometimes rewritten, and often believed even when it is wrong. Peak end rule. In the 1990s, psychologist Daniel Kahneman and his colleagues discovered a curious truth about how we remember experiences. They found that when we think back on events, we don't recall them as complete timelines filled with every detail. Instead, our memory focuses on just two moments: the peak of the experience, when the emotions are at their strongest, and the end of the experience when it concludes. This became known as the peak end rule. To understand this, imagine you go on a 2-week vacation. During that time, there are countless little ups and downs. Some days are sunny, others rainy, some meals are delicious, others disappointing. You might think that when you look back, you would weigh all of those days equally to form an overall impression. But that isn't how the brain works. Instead, your memory highlights one or two especially intense moments: the breathtaking sunset on the beach, or the stressful argument with a travel partner, and then locks onto the final moments of the trip. If the vacation ended on a high note, like a wonderful dinner, your memory of the entire vacation will lean positive. If it ended with a delayed flight or food poisoning, you may look back and label the entire vacation as bad, even if most of it was pleasant. This rule explains why our memories of events often don't match the reality of what we lived through. Kahneman demonstrated this with a clever experiment involving physical discomfort. Participants were asked to place their hand in painfully cold water for a set amount of time. In one trial, they kept their hand submerged for 60 seconds. In another, they kept it submerged for 90 seconds. But during the last 30 seconds, the water was made slightly warmer, though still uncomfortable. Objectively, the second experience was worse. It lasted longer, and people endured more total pain. But when asked which trial they would repeat, most chose the longer one. Why? Because it ended less painfully. Their memory of the experience was shaped not by the total suffering, but by the peak moment of pain and the way the experience ended. The peak end rule reveals something unsettling. Our remembered self does not always align with our experiencing self. In other words, the version of you who lives through an event and the version of you who remembers it later are not the same. The experiencing self feels every detail in the moment: the boredom, the discomfort, the joy, the waiting. But the remembering self ignores most of those details and judges the event based only on the highlights and the ending. This is why we sometimes look back fondly on things that felt miserable while they were happening, or why we dismiss enjoyable experiences because they ended badly. Memory simplifies reality, and that simplification shapes the stories we tell ourselves about our own lives. Think about childbirth. Many mothers describe labor as excruciating, yet later they speak of the experience as meaningful, even beautiful. Why? Because the peak of emotion, holding their child for the first time, overrides the long hours of pain. The ending defines the memory more than the middle. The same applies to other intense experiences. A grueling marathon may feel like endless suffering in the moment, but the euphoric finish line becomes the peak memory. Later, the runner recalls it as one of the greatest days of their life, forgetting the hours of agony. This is why people willingly repeat difficult experiences. They don't remember the suffering accurately. They remember the highlights. This rule also applies to entertainment. Think of a movie that is slow for the first hour, but ends with a powerful, emotional finale. Most viewers walk away satisfied because the ending shapes their overall impression. Meanwhile, a movie that is thrilling at the start but fizzles out at the end often leaves audiences disappointed, even if most of the runtime was enjoyable. The ending colors the memory more than the middle. The same is true for concerts, vacations, and even conversations. We remember how things ended more than how they unfolded. Businesses use the peak end rule to design customer experiences. A hotel may not be able to make every moment perfect, but if it delivers a few memorable peaks, like a surprise upgrade or a personalized gesture, and ensures the guest leaves on a positive note, the overall memory will be glowing. Doctors use it when performing uncomfortable procedures, sometimes extending them slightly with a less painful ending. So, patients remember the experience more positively and are more willing to return. Teachers apply it by ending lessons with something engaging or inspiring, so students remember the class as more enjoyable than it may have been in the moment. But the peak end rule can also trap us. We may stay in unhealthy situations because our memories deceive us. A toxic relationship might be filled with long stretches of unhappiness, but if it has intense highs, the peak of passion, and occasional kind endings after fights, we may look back and label it as worth it. The brain highlights the peaks and the reconciliations while forgetting the daily misery. Similarly, gamblers recall the thrill of winning and the relief of a lucky streak far more vividly than the hours of loss in between. Their memories are biased by the peak and the end, making them believe gambling is more rewarding than it really is. This rule also affects how we process life events over time. When we recall a year of our lives, we don't replay it month by month. Instead, we recall the highlights, the best moments, the worst struggles, and the way the year ended. This is why New Year's Eve feels symbolic. If the year closes on a hopeful note, we label the whole year as good. If it ends in disappointment, the year feels wasted. The remembering self rewrites the story of our lives through this lens. The peak end rule teaches us something important about happiness. It isn't enough to simply have pleasant experiences. What matters most is how those experiences are remembered. If you want to create lasting positive memories, focus on creating meaningful peaks and positive endings. A family trip may be full of stress, but if it ends with laughter and connection, that's what will be remembered. A project at work may be exhausting, but if it ends in celebration, it becomes a proud memory. This means we can shape our future happiness not just by how we live experiences, but by how we end them. Kahneman once said that we don't choose between experiences, we choose between memories of experiences. When deciding whether to repeat something, we don't ask, how did it feel moment to moment? We ask, how do I remember it? And because memory is ruled by peaks and endings, that is what guides our choices. This explains why people willingly climb mountains, run marathons, or endure hardships for the sake of a meaningful story. The experiencing self may suffer, but the remembering self treasures the memory. The peak end rule is both empowering and cautionary. It empowers us because it means we can design better lives by focusing on creating positive highlights and meaningful conclusions. But it cautions us to remember that memory is biased. Just because we recall something fondly doesn't mean it was truly good for us. And just because something ended badly doesn't mean it wasn't valuable overall. By becoming aware of this rule, we can make wiser choices, savoring good endings, creating powerful peaks, and remembering that the story our mind tells about the past is never the full story. Dunning-Kruger Effect. In 1999, two psychologists, David Dunning and Justin Kruger, published a study that revealed one of the most ironic truths about human behavior. The people who know the least often believe they know the most. They called this the Dunning-Kruger Effect. It describes a cognitive bias in which individuals with low ability, knowledge, or expertise in a particular area greatly overestimate their own competence. At the same time, those who are highly skilled tend to underestimate themselves, assuming that what is easy for them must be easy for others too. This paradox creates a world where the most confident voices are not always the most accurate ones. The inspiration for this study came from an almost absurd event. A man named MacArthur Wheeler attempted to rob two banks in Pittsburgh in broad daylight without wearing a mask. He was quickly arrested. When questioned, Wheeler seemed genuinely confused. He had rubbed lemon juice on his face, believing it would make him invisible to security cameras. After all, lemon juice can be used as invisible ink. So, he assumed the same principle applied to his skin. To Dunning and Kruger, Wheeler was a perfect example of ignorance breeding confidence. He didn't know enough about chemistry to realize how wrong his belief was, and because he lacked that knowledge, he had no doubt at all. Intrigued, the psychologists conducted a series of experiments. They asked participants to take tests in areas like grammar, logical reasoning, and humor. Afterward, the participants were asked to rate their own performance. Consistently, those who scored in the bottom quartile vastly overestimated how well they had done. They believed they were above average, when in reality they were far below. In contrast, those who performed at the top often underestimated themselves, believing they were merely average. The results were clear. PE. People with little skill not only make mistakes, but they lack the ability to recognize their mistakes. And people with high skill assume that others must also find it easy, which makes them doubt their own superiority. The Dunning-Kruger Effect reveals a blind spot in self-awareness. When you don't know much about a subject, you don't even know enough to see your own errors. It's like being lost in a city without realizing you're lost, because you don't recognize the landmarks. Knowledge gives you the ability to measure yourself accurately. Without it, your mind tricks you into believing you're more capable than you really are. This is why beginners often brim with confidence, while experts are filled with doubt. This effect shows up everywhere. In the workplace, an unskilled employee may be convinced they are performing exceptionally, while their competent peers quietly question themselves. In politics, people with little understanding of complex issues may speak with great certainty, while true experts, aware of the nuances, speak with caution. On social media, voices with limited knowledge often shout the loudest, gaining followers because confidence is mistaken for credibility. Meanwhile, those with genuine expertise hesitate, aware of the complexity, and are sometimes drowned out. The irony is painful. The less someone knows, the more convinced they are that they are right. The Dunning-Kruger Effect also helps explain why misinformation spreads so easily. Someone who reads a headline or a single article may feel empowered to debate experts on the topic, convinced they see the truth clearly. They mistake shallow familiarity for deep understanding. True experts, on the other hand, often express uncertainty, acknowledging the limits of their knowledge. To the casual observer, the confident amateur appears more convincing than the cautious professional. This dynamic fuels online arguments, conspiracy theories, and dangerous overconfidence in all areas of life. But the effect doesn't just apply to ignorance. It also affects people who are truly skilled. Highly competent individuals often underestimate themselves because they assume others find the same tasks easy. A talented mathematician might think, if I can solve this problem quickly, anyone can. A gifted writer may dismiss their skill, assuming that others can effortlessly put words together too. This humility, while admirable, can lead them to undervalue their own talents. In some cases, it prevents them from speaking up, leaving the stage open to the less qualified but more confident. The Dunning-Kruger Effect teaches us that self-perception is flawed. Confidence is not always a sign of competence, and doubt is not always a sign of weakness. Sometimes, doubt is a sign of wisdom. The more you learn, the more you realize how much there is you don't know. Socrates captured this long ago when he said, "The only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing." Experts see the vastness of knowledge and feel small. Novices, blind to what they don't know, feel large. Understanding this bias has practical importance. For one, it reminds us to be cautious about our own confidence. Just because we feel certain doesn't mean we are right. Certainty can be a trap, especially in areas we know little about. It also reminds us not to dismiss those who express doubt. In fact, those who acknowledge uncertainty may be more trustworthy than those who claim to know everything. Awareness of the Dunning-Kruger Effect can make us more humble learners, more respectful listeners, and more careful decision-makers. The effect also raises questions about education. How do we teach people not just facts, but the humility to recognize the limits of their knowledge? Part of the answer lies in experience. When people are exposed to deeper levels of a subject, they often realize just how much they don't care. Now, this is sometimes called the valley of despair on the Dunning-Kruger curve. At first, knowledge brings confidence. Then, as people learn more, their confidence drops sharply as they see the complexity. Only after years of study does confidence rise again, tempered by wisdom and humility. In life, we all move along this curve in different areas. At times, we are beginners who think we know it all. At other times, we are cautious learners aware of our ignorance. And sometimes, we become skilled enough to see the big picture, balancing confidence with humility. The challenge is to recognize where we are on that curve at any given moment, and to resist the temptation of overconfidence. The Dunning-Kruger Effect is not just about others, it is about us. Every one of us has blind spots. Every one of us has areas where we think we are better than we are. Recognizing this is the first step to growth. It requires honesty, humility, and the courage to admit when we might be wrong. It requires listening to others, especially those with more experience. And it requires remembering that confidence alone is not proof of competence. At its core, the Dunning-Kruger Effect is a reminder of human fallibility. It tells us that ignorance can masquerade as certainty, and expertise can disguise itself as doubt. In a world full of loud voices and bold claims, it urges us to look deeper, to question confidence, and to value humility. Because sometimes, the smartest person in the room is the one who admits they don't have all the answers. Framing effect. In the 1980s, psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky conducted a groundbreaking series of studies that revealed something unsettling about human decision-making. The way a choice is presented, its frame, can dramatically change the decision people make, even if the underlying facts remain identical. This discovery became known as the framing effect. It showed that we are not the purely rational thinkers we like to believe we are. Instead, our judgments and choices can be manipulated simply by the wording of a problem or the emotional lens through which it is presented. One of their most famous experiments involved a hypothetical disease outbreak. Participants were told that a new disease was expected to kill 600 people. They were then presented with two possible programs to combat it. In one version of the experiment, the options were framed in terms of lives saved. Program A would save 200 people for sure, while Program B offered a 1/3 chance that all 600 people would be saved, and a 2/3 chance that no one would be saved. When framed this way, most people chose Program A, preferring the certainty of saving 200 lives. But in another version of the same problem, the options were framed in terms of lives lost. Program A would result in 400 people dying, while Program B offered a 1/3 chance that no one would die, and a 2/3 chance that all 600 would die. Notice that the numbers are exactly the same. Saving 200 lives is the same as losing 400. But when framed in terms of losses, most people shifted their choice to Program B, willing to gamble in order to avoid certain death. The facts never changed. What changed was the frame, the emotional window through which the problem was presented. This finding reveals something profound about human psychology. We are not driven only by logic, but by perception. When something is framed as a gain, we prefer safety. When it is framed as a loss, we prefer risk. This explains why businesses and politicians carefully choose their words. An investment might be framed as having a 90% success rate rather than a 10% failure rate. A candidate might describe a policy as protecting jobs rather than delaying layoffs. Both frames describe the same reality, but one feels reassuring while the other feels threatening, and feelings drive choices. The framing effect shapes everyday decisions more than we realize. Take health communication, for example. A doctor might say, "This surgery has a 90% survival rate." That sounds hopeful, but if the same doctor said, "This surgery has a 10% mortality rate," many patients would feel anxious, even though the numbers mean exactly the same thing. The choice of words can tip the balance between acceptance and refusal of treatment. Similarly, a food label that says 95% fat-free sounds more appealing than one that says contains 5% fat. People are more likely to buy the first, even though both describe the identical product. Marketers exploit this bias constantly. Products are framed in terms of what you gain, not what you lose. Insurance companies emphasize peace of mind rather than fear of disaster. Advertisements tell you what you'll gain by buying something, not what you'll lose by not buying it. Unless, of course, they deliberately frame it as "don't miss out," activating loss aversion. The frame manipulates how the brain interprets the choice. It pushes you toward a decision without altering the actual information. The framing effect also shapes how we view the past. If a relationship ends, one person may frame it as a waste of years, while another may frame it as a valuable learning experience. Both describe the same timeline, but the frame changes the emotional weight. In politics, wars can be framed as defending freedom or as costly foreign interventions. Economies can be framed as recovering steadily or still struggling. Each frame emphasizes one perspective while downplaying another, guiding how people feel and how they choose to act. What's striking about the framing effect is that it bypasses rational thought. Even when people are aware of it, they are not immune. If someone says a vaccine is 95% effective, it feels more trustworthy than if they say it fails in 5% of cases, even though both are logically identical. The human brain is wired to react emotionally to language, not just analytically to numbers. This is tied to the way our brains evolved. For survival, it was often more efficient to respond quickly to emotional cues than to process abstract statistics. And so, even in modern life, a simple change of wording can redirect our decisions. This effect also explains why conflict can escalate so quickly. Imagine two groups negotiating. If one group frames a proposal as a chance to build peace, the response may be positive. But if it's framed as a risk of losing security, the reaction may be hostile, even if the proposal itself is unchanged. Framing creates perception, and perception creates reality. Wars have been justified, policies approved, and movements launched simply because of how an issue was framed. There's another layer to the framing effect. It interacts with our natural tendency toward loss aversion. Research shows that humans feel the pain of loss more intensely than the pleasure of gain. Losing a 100 hurts far more than gaining 100 fee. L's good. When choices are framed as potential losses, we are more likely to take risks to avoid them. When choices are framed as potential gains, we are more likely to play it safe. This bias influences everything from gambling to investing to health decisions. A gambler keeps playing to avoid the pain of loss, while an investor holds onto a bad stock because selling would mean admitting defeat. The frame shapes the emotional context, and the emotion drives the behavior. The framing effect is not just a curiosity of psychology. It is a tool used every day in persuasion. Politicians know that calling a tax a relief package sounds far better than calling it a government expense. Activists know that calling climate policies protecting our children's future is more powerful than calling them reducing carbon emissions. The words are not just decoration, they frame the story, and once the story is framed, people's minds follow the path it creates. The danger, of course, is that frames can manipulate us without us realizing it. We think we are making decisions based on facts, but often we are reacting to the way those facts are presented. This makes it critical to develop awareness. When you hear a statistic, ask, how else could this be phrased? When you see a headline, ask, what's the opposite frame? By reframing information yourself, you can break free from the automatic pull of the original frame. But the framing effect is not purely negative. It can also be used to encourage positive change. A teacher who frames homework as a chance to practice mastery rather than a requirement can shift how students engage with it. A coach who frames failure as a step in learning rather than a defeat can inspire resilience. A doctor who frames exercise as building strength rather than losing weight can motivate healthier behavior. By consciously choosing frames, we can reshape motivation, hope, and action. At its core, the framing effect reminds us that reality is filtered through language. Facts alone don't dictate how we feel or act. The way they are presented does. We are not as objective as we think. Our brains respond to stories, not just numbers, and the stories are shaped by frames. By becoming aware of this, we can defend ourselves against manipulation, make wiser choices, and also harness the power of framing to inspire ourselves and others. Anchoring bias. Imagine walking into a store and seeing a luxury jacket with a price tag of 10,000. You immediately think, that's way too expensive. But then you notice another jacket right next to it, priced at 350. Suddenly, the second one doesn't seem so bad anymore, even though 350 is still a lot of money for a jacket. What happened in that moment is an example of one of the most powerful cognitive biases known as the anchoring bias. It occurs when we rely too heavily on the first piece of information we encounter, the anchor, when making decisions. That initial number, image, or idea sets a mental benchmark, and everything else is judged relative to it, rather than on its actual value. This bias was studied deeply by psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in the 1970s. In one experiment, they spun a wheel of fortune that was rigged to land on either 10 or 65. Afterward, participants were asked a completely unrelated question. What percentage of African nations are members of the United Nations? Those who saw the wheel land on 10 guessed a much lower percentage, while those who saw 65 guessed much higher numbers. The wheel, which had no connection to the actual facts, had nevertheless anchored their thinking. This experiment revealed something troubling. Arbitrary numbers can shape our judgments without us realizing it. The anchoring bias influences us constantly in everyday life. When negotiating a salary, the first number put on the table often sets the tone for the entire discussion. If an employer offers $40,000, the candidate's counteroffer will hover close to that range. If the employer had started with $60,000, the whole negotiation would shift upward. The first number acts like gravity, pulling every subsequent number toward it. Real estate agents know this well. A house listed at $500,000 feels different from one listed at $400,000, even if the actual values are similar. The higher starting point anchors buyers' expectations, making them think $480,000 is a good deal. This bias doesn't just shape financial decisions. It shapes how we see risk, probability, and even morality. For example, a jury asked to recommend a prison sentence may be influenced by the prosecutor's initial suggestion, even if it's arbitrary. If the prosecutor suggests 20 years, the jurors may settle on 15. If the suggestion was 5 years, the jurors may choose 8. The anchor shifts the entire frame of judgment. The same occurs with consumer behavior. If a restaurant menu lists a $200 bottle of wine at the top, the $80 bottle seems reasonable. If the most expensive option was $90, the same $80 bottle would feel overpriced. One reason the anchoring bias is so powerful is that our brains crave reference points. When faced with uncertainty, we look for something to hold on to, even if it's irrelevant. The anchor provides that illusion of certainty. We adjust our judgments from it, but we rarely adjust enough. This is why salespeople, marketers, and negotiators use anchoring strategically. They know that the first number or idea you hear will stick in your mind like glue, shaping every judgment that follows. Anchoring also affects our personal lives. Consider relationships. If someone's first partner treated them poorly, they may unconsciously anchor their expectations for love at a lower standard. When someone later treats them slightly better, they may think it's wonderful, without realizing they're still settling for less than they deserve. The anchor of past experience influences what they believe is normal or acceptable. Similarly, if your first job pays very little, you might anchor your sense of worth to that low number, undervaluing yourself for years. Anchors can quietly define the boundaries of what we think we deserve. The danger of anchoring is that it narrows our vision. Instead of evaluating situations independently, we cling to the first number, word, or idea we hear. This is especially dangerous in uncertain situations where we don't have complete information. For example, in medical decisions, if a doctor says, "This treatment has a 70% success rate," the patient may anchor on that number, feeling optimistic. If instead the doctor says, "This treatment has a 30% failure rate," the exact same reality feels darker. Anchors frame reality, and in doing so, they alter our emotions and choices. Anchoring bias can even shape how we view ourselves. Think about grades in school. A student who consistently scores 60 out of 100 may anchor their sense of ability around that number. Later, when they score 70, they feel like they've achieved greatness, even though it's still below average. On the other hand, a student who regularly scores in the 90s may see a 90 as a disappointment because their anchor is so high. Anchors set our expectations, and expectations shape how we interpret success and failure. Another fascinating example is in perception of time and effort. If someone tells you a task will take only 20 minutes and it ends up taking 40, you feel frustrated because your anchor was low. But if they told you it might take 2 hours and it only takes 40 minutes, you feel relieved. The actual task was the same, but your anchor shaped your entire experience of it. Anchoring can even be seen in how we view history and culture. If the first story we hear about a country, a person, or an event is negative, it becomes the anchor against which all future information is judged. Even if positive stories follow, the initial anchor influences our perception for years. This is why first impressions are so powerful. They become mental anchors, defining how we evaluate everything afterward. Break. Being free from the anchoring bias is difficult because it happens unconsciously, but awareness is the first step. When you see a price, ask yourself, is this number actually meaningful, or is it just an anchor? When negotiating, prepare your own anchor rather than letting someone else set it. When making judgments, consciously consider multiple perspectives before settling on a decision. By recognizing anchors for what they are, starting points, not truths, we can loosen their grip on our minds. Anchoring is not always harmful. Sometimes it can be used positively. For example, if a teacher tells students that they are capable of high achievement, that anchor can raise their self-expectations and motivate them. If a leader frames a vision of greatness, people may anchor their hopes and actions around that higher standard. Anchors can inspire as much as they can deceive. The challenge is to set anchors intentionally, rather than being unconsciously pulled by them. At its heart, the anchoring bias is a reminder of how easily our minds can be nudged. A single number, a single phrase, a single starting point can bend our entire judgment. We think we are being logical, but often we are simply orbiting the anchor someone else dropped into our minds. By learning to see these anchors, we gain the power to resist manipulation, to set higher standards for ourselves, and to make choices based on reality rather than the shadows of suggestion. Confirmation bias. Imagine scrolling through your social media feed. You see a headline that supports something you already believe. Maybe it says your political side is right, your favorite diet is healthier, or your opinion about a certain celebrity is validated. You click it, nod in agreement, maybe even share it. Then, a few posts later, you see another headline that challenges your belief, suggesting the opposite. You scroll past it quickly, maybe even dismiss it as fake news. What just happened in those few seconds is one of the most powerful cognitive biases that shapes human thought, the confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is our tendency to favor information that agrees with what we already believe, while ignoring, dismissing, or undervaluing information that contradicts us. It's not just about reading the news, it's about how we process all information. We actively seek out evidence that proves us right, and we unconsciously filter out evidence that proves us wrong. In doing so, we build a bubble of self-reinforcing beliefs, convinced that the world looks exactly the way we think it does. The roots of confirmation bias run deep in human psychology. Thousands of years ago, our ancestors relied on quick judgments for survival. If someone believed a certain berry was poisonous, they avoided it. If they believed a predator lurked in a certain area, they stayed away. Questioning those beliefs constantly could have slowed them down and put them in danger. Instead, the brain evolved to reinforce existing beliefs, making life feel more predictable. Today, however, that same survival mechanism works against us. It makes us cling to flawed ideas, reject useful criticism, and resist learning. Psychologists have shown this bias in countless experiments. One classic study asked participants to test the rule: if a card has an even number on one side, it must have a red C, galore on the other side. 4 cards were placed on the table, one showing an even number, one showing an odd number, one red, and one not red. Most people turned over the cards that could confirm the rule, the even number, and the red card. But logically, the right move was to turn over the even number and the not red card because that could disprove the rule. People weren't interested in testing the truth. They were interested in proving themselves right. This simple test revealed a universal pattern. We prefer confirmation over contradiction, even at the expense of accuracy. The confirmation bias shows up in our daily lives in subtle and obvious ways. When someone believes a certain diet works, they notice every success story that supports it and ignore failures. A person who thinks their favorite sports team is the best pays attention to their victories but dismisses their defeats as bad luck. In relationships, if we believe someone dislikes us, we notice every small frown or missed text as proof, while ignoring moments of kindness. Once we form a belief, the mind turns into a lawyer, building a case in its defense, instead of acting like a scientist testing whether the belief is true. Social media amplifies this bias to dangerous levels. Algorithms are designed to show us what we already like and agree with, because that keeps us engaged longer. If you watch one video about a conspiracy theory, the platform recommends 10 more. If you read an article from one political perspective, your feed fills with more of the same. Slowly, your world narrows into an echo chamber, where everyone seems to agree with you. The more you see confirming evidence, the more convinced you become that your belief is absolute truth. Meanwhile, opposing perspectives feel distant, hostile, even ridiculous. This is how societies become polarized, each side locked in its own bubble, fed daily doses of confirmation. But confirmation bias doesn't only apply to groups. It affects individuals in critical ways. Students who believe they are bad at math notice every mistake as proof, but ignore the times they solve problems correctly. Someone who thinks they're unlucky notices every setback, but forgets every small success. A person who fears they're unworthy of love interprets every disagreement as proof, while ignoring signs of affection. Our biases shape not only our perception of the world, but our perception of ourselves. This bias also plays out in science, medicine, and business. Doctors, for example, sometimes diagnose patients too quickly and then unconsciously look for symptoms that confirm their first guess, overlooking clues that point elsewhere. Investors buy a stock, then focus only on news that supports their choice, ignoring warning signs. Leaders launch a strategy, then surround themselves with advisors who agree with them, while silencing dissent. In each case, confirmation bias clouds judgment, leading to costly mistakes. One reason confirmation bias is so powerful is that it feels good. Finding evidence that agrees with us gives us a small burst of satisfaction, like winning an argument. On the other hand, confronting information that contradicts us feels uncomfortable. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, the mental tension that comes from holding two conflicting ideas. To reduce that discomfort, we reject or distort the contradictory information. This is why people dig in during debates, even when evidence piles up against them. They aren't just defending a belief, they're protecting their sense of identity and comfort. The bias also creates blind spots in relationships and society. Couples in conflict often talk past each other, each side only hearing what confirms their grievances. Political groups demonize opponents because they only consume information that proves the other side is wrong. Even in friendships, once we decide someone always acts selfish, every action is seen through that lens, even when it isn't true. Confirmation bias locks us into rigid stories, blinding us to the full reality. So, how do we fight this bias? The first step is awareness. Simply knowing confirmation bias exists makes us more cautious. When you read something that supports your belief, ask, what evidence would disprove this? When you feel certain, ask, what might I be ignoring? Another tool is to deliberately expose yourself to opposing views, not to argue, but to understand. Listening to different perspectives weakens the echo chamber. In science, double-blind experiments and peer review exist precisely to reduce confirmation bias. In business, strong leaders encourage dissenting voices to avoid blind spots. And in personal life, humility helps, recognizing that being wrong is not a weakness, but an opportunity to grow. Confirmation bias will never disappear completely. It's woven into the way our minds work, but we can manage it. We can train ourselves to think more like scientists, testing ideas rather than defending them. We can embrace discomfort as a sign that we're learning, not failing. And we can build relationships and communities that value truth more than being right. At its core, confirmation bias is a reminder of how fragile truth can be in the human mind. We are not neutral observers of reality. We are storytellers, constantly weaving narratives that make us feel safe and justified. But if we have the courage to step outside our stories, to confront opposing evidence, and to challenge our own certainty, we open the door to wisdom. Because the truth does not fear being tested, but our biases do. IKEA Effect. In 2011, psychologists Michael Norton, Daniel Moshon, and Dan Ariely conducted a series of experiments that revealed something fascinating about human psychology. People place disproportionately high value on things they build or assemble themselves, even when the result is imperfect. They called this phenomenon the IKEA Effect, named after the Swedish furniture giant that became famous for its do-it-yourself assembly products. At first glance, the idea seems strange. Why would anyone prefer a wobbly chair they put together themselves over a perfectly assembled one built by a professional? Why would someone take pride in a crooked bookshelf that required hours of frustration? The answer lies in the deep psychological connection between effort, ownership, and value. When we invest our time, energy, and creativity into something, we don't just build an object, we build a piece of ourselves into it. That emotional labor transforms the object into something more than just material. It becomes meaningful. In their study, Norton and his colleagues asked participants to assemble IKEA furniture, fold origami, and even build simple Lego projects. Later, they were asked how much they would pay for these items. Surprisingly, people were willing to pay as much for their own poorly folded origami as they would for origami folded by experts. Why? Because effort created value. The act of building something made it feel more important, more personal, and more worthy of investment. The work itself transformed the perception of worth. The IKEA effect is part of a larger psychological principle. We value things more when we put effort into them. This explains why homemade meals often feel more satisfying than takeout, even when the taste is similar. The time and energy we spend cooking makes the food feel richer. It explains why parents treasure their children's messy drawings more than expensive artwork. It explains why a garden filled with vegetables we grew ourselves feels more rewarding than the same vegetables bought from the store. Effort creates attachment, and attachment magnifies value. But the IKEA effect goes beyond physical objects. It shapes how we see our ideas, projects, and even relationships. Think of a team working on a difficult project. Each member invests countless hours into it. By the end, even if the project is flawed, they defend it passionately because their effort has bonded them to it. Or consider relationships. When we put work into understanding, supporting, and building a connection with someone, that relationship becomes more precious to us. It is not just about who they are, but about the labor of love we poured into it. The work makes the bond stronger. This effect can also explain why people often cling to their own ideas, even when those ideas aren't the best. When someone spends time developing a solution or creating a plan, they become attached to it. They see it as valuable because they invested effort into it. This is why brainstorming sessions can be tricky. People fight for their own ideas, not necessarily because those ideas are superior, but because they feel ownership. Their effort creates pride, and pride resists letting go. The IKEA effect also reveals something about how we see success. Many people assume that happiness comes from avoiding effort, that if life were easier, we'd be happier. But the opposite is often true. Struggle and effort give meaning to our achievements. A person who climbs a mountain values the view far more than someone who was dropped there by a helicopter. A student who works tirelessly for a degree treasures it more than someone who breezes through effortlessly. The work adds weight to the reward. Without effort, the reward feels hollow. Marketers and businesses use this principle to their advantage. IKEA's flat-pack furniture is not just a cost-saving strategy, it's a psychological one. By making customers part of the construction process, they increase the attachment people feel to the product. The same strategy is used in customizable products, from build your own pizza to design your own sneakers. When customers participate in creating the final product, they value it more, even if it isn't objectively better. The effort creates ownership, and ownership creates loyalty. But the IKEA effect also has a downside. Sometimes, we overvalue what we've built, even when it's flawed. Think of a business owner clinging to a failing product because they invested years into developing it, or a person defending a bad idea because they spent so much time creating it. This is related to the sunk cost fallacy, where people continue investing in something because of the time and effort already spent. The IKEA effect makes us blind to flaws because our effort has tied our identity to the outcome. It also plays out in personal life. Someone may stay in a failing relationship, not because it's healthy, but because they've invested so much effort into it. The work they've put in makes them believe it must be valuable. They confuse effort with worth, forgetting that sometimes the most effortful things are not the most rewarding. The danger of the IKEA effect is that it can trap us in situations where we keep building, not because it's good, but because we can't bear to admit that our effort didn't create value. Despite its downsides, the IKEA effect teaches us a powerful truth about human motivation. We don't just value results, we value the journey that leads to them. Struggle, labor, and effort are not enemies of happiness. They are its foundation. People feel proud of their achievements not because they were easy, but because they were hard. We find meaning in the things we sweat for, in the things we create, in the things that carry a piece of our time and energy inside them. The next time you look at a crooked shelf, a lopsided cake, or a project that took more hours than it should have, remember that its value lies not only in how it looks, but in what it represents. It represents your effort, your patience, your persistence, and that effort is what makes it meaningful. The IKEA effect is a reminder that life's greatest treasures are not handed to us. They are built, piece by piece, mistake by mistake, hour by hour. And because we build them ourselves, they become priceless. Milgram Obedience Study. In the early 1960s at Yale University, a psychologist named Stanley Milgram set out to answer a haunting question. Why do ordinary people obey authority, even when it leads them to commit terrible acts? The world was still reeling from the horrors of World War II, particularly the Holocaust. Many Nazi officials, when put on trial, defended themselves by saying, "I was only following orders." Milgram wanted to know if obedience to authority could really explain how so many seemingly normal individuals became part of such atrocities. Could regular people, without hatred or malice, be persuaded to harm others simply because someone in authority told them to? To test this, Milgram designed what became one of the most famous and controversial experiments in psychology. Participants were recruited for what they thought was a study on memory and learning. They were introduced to another participant, supposedly chosen at random to play the role of learner, while they themselves would be the teacher. What the teacher didn't know was that the learner was an actor, working with Milgram. The teacher's job was simple. Each time the learner made a mistake on a memory task, the teacher had to administer an electric shock. The shock machine was an intimidating piece of equipment. It had switches labeled from 15 volts, slight shock, all the way up to 450 volts. Danger, severe shock, and finally XXX. The teacher was told to increase the shock level with every mistake. In reality, no shocks were being delivered, but the learner acted as though they were real, crying out in pain, begging for mercy, and eventually falling silent as if unconscious. Here's where the experiment became chilling. When participants hesitated, worried about the suffering they were causing, the authority figure, dressed in a lab coat, calmly instructed them to continue the experiments. And Ter didn't threaten them with punishment. Instead, he used simple phrases. "Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on." And astonishingly, the majority of participants obeyed. Milgram found that 65% of participants went all the way to the maximum 450-volt shock, even though they believed they might be seriously harming or even killing another person. Nearly all participants reached at least 300 volts. Many were visibly distressed, sweating, trembling, and pleading to stop. But when faced with the calm authority of the experimenter, they continued anyway. They obeyed, even against their own conscience. This result shocked the world. It revealed that obedience to authority is not just about personality or morality. It is deeply ingrained in human behavior. Ordinary people, placed in extraordinary circumstances, will follow orders that go against their values. The study challenged the comforting belief that atrocities are committed only by monsters or inherently evil people. Instead, it suggested that under the right conditions, almost anyone could be led to harm others. The Milgram obedience study sparked endless debate. Some critics argued that participants must have known the shocks weren't real, but Milgram's recordings and follow-up interviews showed otherwise. Many participants were traumatized, shaken by what they believed they had done. Others defended their obedience, saying they trusted the authority figure. Some rationalized it by claiming the experimenter must have known what was safe. What was clear was that obedience was powerful enough to override personal morals. Why did people obey? Milgram identified several key factors. First, the authority of the experimenter, the lab coat, the Yale setting, and the professional tone all signaled legitimacy. People are trained from childhood to respect authority figures, teachers, doctors, leaders, and that conditioning is hard to resist. Second, the gradual escalation. Participants didn't start at 450 volts. They started at 15, then 30, then 45. Each increase was small, making it easier to justify. By the time they reached dangerous levels, they felt trapped by their earlier decisions. Third, the diffusion of responsibility. Participants believed they were just following instructions, and therefore not personally responsible for the outcome. This psychological distancing allowed them to obey without fully confronting the morality of their actions. Milgram's study has been replicated in various forms around the world, and the results have been frighteningly consistent. Whether in the United States, Germany, or Australia, ordinary people show the same tendency to obey authority, even when it causes harm. Even in modern times, variations of the experiment have produced similar levels of obedience. The conclusion is clear. The impulse to obey is not tied to culture or history. It is a universal feature of human psychology. The study's implications extend far beyond the laboratory. In the military, soldiers are trained to follow orders without hesitation. This is necessary for discipline, but it also creates the risk that individuals will obey commands that go against morality. In corporations, employees may follow unethical policies because they are instructed to do so by superiors. In everyday life, people may defer to doctors, bosses, or leaders, even when their own instincts raise doubts. Obedience is not inherently bad, but it can be dangerous when authority is abused. Milgram's work also held. P.S. Explain why whistleblowers are rare. Going against authority feels unnatural and risky. People fear punishment, rejection, or being wrong. It takes extraordinary courage to resist. The majority, however, find it easier to obey, even if they are uncomfortable. This is why systemic injustice persists, not because everyone supports it, but because many people choose silent obedience over active resistance. Of course, Milgram's experiment was controversial not only for its findings, but also for its ethics. Many argued that it was cruel to put participants through such stress, believing they had harmed someone. Some participants reported lasting guilt or distress. Today, ethical guidelines in psychology are stricter, and such an experiment would never be approved. Yet despite the controversy, Milgram's study remains one of the most important insights into human behavior ever uncovered. It forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about obedience, authority, and responsibility. At its core, the Milgram obedience study leaves us with a haunting lesson. Evil does not always announce itself with malice or hatred. Sometimes it comes dressed in authority, giving calm instructions. And ordinary people wanting to obey, wanting to do the right thing, may find themselves complicit in terrible acts. The study challenges us to ask, how would we act in the same situation? Would we resist, or would we obey? The truth is, none of us can be entirely certain until we are tested. But knowing about this bias gives us power. Awareness makes resistance more possible. If we remember Milgram's findings, we may pause the next time authority tells us to act against our conscience. We may find the courage to question, to resist, to say no. And perhaps that awareness is the very first step in preventing history's darkest chapters from repeating themselves. Stanford Prison Experiment. In the summer of 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo conducted one of the most infamous and controversial studies in the history of psychology, the Stanford Prison Experiment. It was meant to explore a simple but profound question: how does power affect human behavior? Specifically, what happens when ordinary people are placed in roles of authority and subordination, like guards and prisoners? Would personality determine how they acted, or would the situation itself transform them? To answer this, Zimbardo and his team converted the basement of Stanford University's psychology building into a mock prison. The environment was carefully designed to feel real. Barred cells, uniforms, ID numbers, even a solitary confinement room known as the Hole. 24 male college students were selected from a pool of applicants, all of whom had been screened for psychological stability. The group was randomly assigned roles. Half would be guards and half would be prisoners. Everyone knew it was an experiment, but they were told to immerse themselves in their roles. The guards were given uniforms, whistles, billy clubs, and reflective sunglasses to hide their eyes. The prisoners were stripped of personal identity, dressed in smocks with ID numbers, and referred to only by those numbers. What happened next shocked everyone, even Zimbardo himself. At the start, the guards acted casually, unsure how to enforce authority. But within days, their behavior grew harsher. They began issuing arbitrary commands, waking prisoners at night for head counts, and forcing them to do humiliating tasks like push-ups or cleaning toilets with bare hands. The prisoners, stripped of autonomy, began showing signs of stress. Some protested, others broke down, and a few tried to rebel, only to be crushed by harsher punishments. What was supposed to be a simple simulation quickled. The Stanford prison experiment revealed the dark side of human nature, but more importantly, it revealed the immense power of environments and systems. It suggested that cruelty is not just about bad apples, but about bad barrels, situations that encourage or enable cruelty. People behave differently when given authority, anonymity, and permission. The experiment echoed Milgram's obedience study, but took it a step further, showing not just obedience to authority, but the corruption of power itself. The implications are staggering. The experiment helps explain how ordinary people can commit atrocities in prisons, wars, or authoritarian systems. Guards at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, for example, committed shocking abuses against detainees in the early 2000s. Photos of those abuses mirrored the behaviors from Zimbardo's basement decades earlier: humiliation, degradation, the dehumanization of prisoners. The Stanford prison experiment gave psychology a chilling framework for understanding such events, but the experiment has also faced heavy criticism. Many argue it was unethical, exposing participants to trauma without proper safeguards. Some have suggested that Zimbardo encouraged guards to be more aggressive than they naturally would have been, influencing the results. Others point out that not all guards became abusive. Some resisted, treating prisoners more humanely. Critics argue that the findings may have been exaggerated, or at least not universally applicable. Nonetheless, whether flawed or not, the experiment sparked one of the most important discussions in psychology about ethics, power, and the influence of environment on behavior. One of the key lessons from the experiment is the danger of de-individuation. When people lose their sense of personal identity and accountability, whether by wearing uniforms, hiding behind masks, or acting as part of a group, they are. At its core, the Stanford prison experiment forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. If you were assigned the role of guard, how would you have behaved? Would you resist the pressure to enforce authority, or would you gradually slip into cruelty? If you were a prisoner, would you fight back, or would you break down under the weight of power? The disturbing truth is that most of us cannot answer with certainty. Situations can change us more than we realize. The study's enduring power lies in that realization. It shows us that evil does not always come from inherently evil people. Sometimes it comes from ordinary individuals placed in extraordinary circumstances, people like you and me. And if systems of power can corrupt so quickly, then the responsibility lies with society to build structures that encourage accountability, empathy, and justice. The Stanford prison experiment may have lasted only 6 days, but its legacy has lasted decades. It stands as a mirror held up to human nature, reflecting both our vulnerability to corruption and our responsibility to prevent it. It warns us that the line between good and evil is thinner than we think, and that under the right conditions, anyone can cross it. Bystander Effect. On a cold night in March 1964, a young woman named Kitty Genovese was walking home in Queens, New York, when she was brutally attacked outside her apartment building. The assault lasted more than half an hour. Reports at the time claimed that 38 people either saw or heard parts of the attack, yet no one stepped in to help. No one called the police until it was too late. Kitty's death shocked the nation, but even more shocking was the public reaction. How could so many witnesses fail to act? How could a crowd of ordinary people, each capable of helping, collectively do nothing? This tragedy led psychologists Bibb Latané and John Darley to investigate what they later named the Bystander Effect, the phenomenon where individuals are less likely to offer help in an emergency when others are present. What they discovered was unsettling. The presence of more people actually decreases the likelihood that anyone will act. Responsibility becomes diffused, spread thin across the group, until no one feels personally accountable. Each person looks around, waiting for someone else to step forward. And as they wait, silence grows heavier, action grows less likely, and tragedy becomes more possible. Latané and Darley recreated emergency situations in controlled experiments. In one study, participants were placed in a room that slowly filled with smoke. Alone, most people quickly left the room and reported the danger. But when several people were present, especially if others stayed calm, participants often ignored the smoke, assuming it was not serious. In another study, participants heard what sounded like someone having a seizure in another room. When alone, they rushed to help, but in groups many froze, waiting for someone else to respond. The more bystanders present, the less likely it was that anyone intervened. The bystander effect occurs for several reasons. The bystander effect extends beyond emergencies. It shapes how we respond to bullying in schools, harassment in workplaces, or injustice in society. When a child is bullied in front of classmates, many stand by silently, waiting for someone else to speak up. When employees witness unethical behavior at work, they often remain quiet, assuming others will address it. On social media, people scroll past harmful content, each thinking someone else will intervene. Silence spreads, not because people don't care, but because each one expects someone else to take the first step. One of the most dangerous aspects of the bystander effect is how it normalizes inaction. When people see others doing nothing, it reinforces their own hesitation. It creates a feedback loop. The longer no one acts, the harder it becomes to break the silence. This is why social movements emphasize the power of the first voice. Once one person speaks out, others follow. Courage is contagious, but so is hesitation. The good news is that the bystander effect can be broken. Research shows that when people are trained to recognize it, they are more likely to intervene. Awareness interrupts the automatic tendency to freeze. Programs like bystander intervention training in schools and workplaces teach individuals how to act, even in the presence of others. Simple steps like directly addressing the victim, calling for help, or delegating tasks can pierce the paralysis of the crowd. Breaking the bystander effect often comes down to a mindset shift. Instead of thinking, someone else will handle this, we must train ourselves to think, if I don't act, maybe no one will. Taking responsibility, even in small ways, can save lives. History shows countless examples where one person's courage inspired others to move. A single voice in a protest can spark a movement. A single rescuer in an accident can motivate others. Asch conformity experiments. In the early 1950s at Swarthmore College, psychologist Solomon Asch designed a series of experiments that would forever change the way we think about human behavior in groups. His question was deceptively simple. Why do people so often go along with the crowd, even when the crowd is obviously wrong? Is conformity a conscious choice, or is it a powerful force that bends our judgment without us even realizing? To explore this, Asch created what appeared to be a straightforward test of visual perception. Participants were shown a card with a single vertical line on it, followed by another card with 3 lines of different lengths. The task was simple. Identify which of the 3 lines matched the length of the first. Alone, the task was trivial. Virtually everyone answered correctly, but the true test came when participants were placed in a group with others. Unknown to them, the other participants were actually actors, instructed to give wrong answers on certain trials. The real subject always answered last or near last. The results were shocking. When the group gave an obviously wrong answer, claiming, for example, that a short line was equal in length to the longer one, the real participant often went along with them. About 75% of participants conformed at least once, and overall, 1/3 of responses went along with the group's wrong judgment. Even though their eyes told them one thing, their need to align with the group told them another. Conformity had bent reality. Why did people conform in such a clear-cut situation? Asch identified 2 main reasons. The first was normative influence, the desire to fit in, to avoid standing out, or to prevent embarrassment. Many participants admitted afterward that they knew the group's answer was wrong, but didn't want to be the odd one out. The second was informational influence, the belief that Yet, not everyone conformed. About 1/4 of participants never yielded to the group, even once. These individuals resisted the pressure, even at the cost of being seen as outsiders. Interestingly, Asch found that when just one other person in the group gave the correct answer, conformity dropped sharply. Suddenly, participants felt empowered to follow their own judgment. This shows that resistance is easier when we don't feel alone. A single ally can break the illusion of consensus and give others courage to speak up. This insight is powerful in understanding how change happens. Social movements often begin with 1 or 2 people daring to dissent in the face of overwhelming conformity. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat, she broke the silence of conformity, inspiring others to follow. When whistleblowers speak out against corruption, they often trigger a ripple effect, encouraging others who were too afraid to act. The Asch experiments show that conformity is strong, but it is not unbreakable. Courage, even from a single voice, can turn the tide. Modern research has expanded on Asch's findings, showing that conformity is not just about lines on a card, it operates everywhere. On social media, people are more likely to like a post if they see others have liked it. In politics, individuals often align their views with the dominant opinion in their community. In workplaces, employees may stay quiet during meetings, even when they spot errors, because everyone else seems to agree. The digital age has amplified conformity, surrounding us with feedback loops where majority opinion appears louder and more persuasive than ever. At the same time, nonconformity has become a form of courage and authenticity. Resisting the pull of the group requires self-confidence and conviction. Those who dare to stand apart, whether artists challenging norms, scientists quiz. Robbers Cave Experiment. In the summer of 1954, psychologist Muzafer Sherif conducted one of the most influential studies in social psychology at Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma. His question was simple yet profound. How do groups form? Why do they conflict? And what can be done to bring them back together? To answer this, he and his team created a study that would reveal the roots of prejudice, rivalry, and cooperation. What unfolded over the course of 3 weeks was not just a camp experiment. It was a mirror held up to human society itself. Sharif recruited 22 11-year-old boys, all from similar middle-class backgrounds, none of whom knew each other before the camp. They believed they were attending a fun summer retreat filled with games, swimming, and hiking. But in reality, they were unknowingly part of a carefully orchestrated psychological experiment. The boys were randomly divided into two groups, placed in separate cabins, and kept apart during the first phase of the study. Each group bonded over shared activities, cooking, hiking, swimming, and naturally began forming its own identity. They chose team names, created flags, and developed inside jokes. One group called themselves the Rattlers, the other the Eagles. At first, everything seemed peaceful, but Sharif had a plan. In the second phase, the two groups were introduced to each other, and immediately, competition was introduced. They competed in games like tug-of-war, baseball, and treasure hunts. Points were tallied, prizes were promised to the winners. What had been two groups of carefree boys quickly turned into rivals locked in fierce competition. Tension rose, and the atmosphere shifted from playful to hostile. The results were dramatic. The boys began taunting each other, raiding each other's cabins, and even vandalizing each other's property. Hostility escalated so quickly that fights broke out. They hurled insults, ripped each other's flags, and refused to eat together in the same dining hall. What Sharif had uncovered was that simply creating two groups and putting them into competition was enough to spark division, prejudice, and aggression. The boys weren't inherently hostile. Circumstances had turned them into enemies. This became known as realistic conflict theory, the idea that intergroup hostility arises when groups compete for limited resources, whether material or symbolic. The Rattlers and Eagles were not fighting over survival, but the prizes and pride were enough to create genuine animosity. Sharif had shown that conflict between groups can emerge quickly and fiercely when competition is introduced, even among children who had no prior reason to dislike each other. But the study didn't end there. Sharif also wanted to explore how to reduce this hostility. Could enemies become allies again? To test this, he designed a third phase of the experiment: cooperation through shared goals. The researchers created a series of crises that neither group could solve alone. For example, the camp's water supply was mysteriously cut off, and the boys had to work together to find the blocked pipe and restore the flow. Another time, the camp's truck broke down, and the boys had to join forces to pull it up a hill. At first, the Rattlers and Eagles were reluctant, still clinging to their rivalry. But necessity forced cooperation. Slowly, as they worked side by side to solve these problems, hostility began to fade. They started eating meals together again, joking with each other, and even pooling their resources to buy a movie for everyone to watch. By the end of camp, the boys who had once been enemies were riding home on the same bus, singing songs together. The Robbers Cave experiment demonstrated two crucial truths about human behavior. First, intergroup conflict is not always about deep-seated hatred. It often arises from circumstances, competition, scarcity, or perceived threats. Second, conflict can be reduced not just by talking about peace, but by creating superordinate goals, objectives so important that they require cooperation between groups. When groups must work together toward a shared purpose, divisions can fade and unity can emerge. The lessons of this experiment echo far beyond a summer camp. They help explain conflicts between nations, political parties, ethnic groups, and even departments within a company. When groups see themselves as rivals competing for resources, whether land, power, recognition, or money, conflict is almost inevitable. But when they are given a higher goal that transcends their differences, cooperation becomes. Their bridge study, in 1974, psychologists Donald Dutton and Arthur Aaron conducted a study in Vancouver, Canada, that would become one of the most fascinating demonstrations of how our emotions can be misinterpreted by the mind. The experiment has since been famously known as the bridge study, and it revealed a strange but powerful truth. When our bodies are aroused, whether by fear, excitement, or adrenaline, we often mistake that arousal for something else, like attraction. The setup was deceptively simple. Dutton and Aaron placed male participants in two different locations. One was on a high, shaky suspension bridge that swayed precariously over a deep canyon. The other was on a low, stable bridge close to the ground. On each bridge, the men were approached by an attractive female experimenter who asked them to complete a brief survey. Afterward, she handed them her phone number, suggesting they could call if they had further questions about the study. The results were startling. Men who met the woman on the high, swaying bridge were far more likely to call her later than those who met her on the stable bridge. Not only that, but the stories they wrote during the survey contained more sexual imagery when they were on the shaky bridge. The conclusion was clear. The heightened arousal caused by fear and adrenaline on the high bridge was misattributed to sexual attraction. Their racing hearts and sweaty palms weren't just signs of fear, they were also fueling feelings of desire. This phenomenon is known as misattribution of arousal. The body sends signals like a pounding heart, quickened breathing, and sweaty hands, but the brain doesn't always interpret them correctly. Instead of recognizing those signals as fear or excitement, we may mistakenly link them to the person or situation in front of us. In the bridge study, the men weren't necessarily more attracted to the experiment. Dutton and Aaron's bridge study also highlighted how context amplifies attraction. Meeting someone in a safe, ordinary setting is different from meeting them in a high-stakes or adrenaline-filled moment. This is why so many romantic comedies feature couples falling in love during chaotic or adventurous circumstances. They reflect a psychological truth. Risk and arousal intensify emotions, making connections feel stronger and more memorable. But there's a deeper lesson here. The bridge study reminds us that our emotions are not always trustworthy guides. We often assume that what we feel is an accurate reflection of reality. If we feel attracted, we believe it's about the person. If we feel fear, we believe it's about the danger. But the study shows that emotions are malleable, open to interpretation, and often shaped by context rather than truth. This insight forces us to question how much of what we feel is about the world, and how much is about the story our brain is telling in the moment. Critics of the study have pointed out that not every situation of arousal leads to misattribution. Other factors, such as personality, timing, and prior expectations, play a role. Not every man on the bridge called the experimenter after all, and yet, the consistent pattern across variations of the experiment suggests that the misattribution of arousal is a powerful and common phenomenon. It reveals a blind spot in human perception, one that influences not only romance but countless other areas of life. The bridge study also connects to broader theories of emotion, such as the two-factor theory of emotion, developed by psychologists Stanley Schachter and Jerome Singer. According to this theory, emotions are the product of two components: physiological arousal and cognitive interpretation. The same bodily arousal can be labeled as different emotions depending on the situation. The mere exposure effect. Imagine hearing a new song for the first time. At first, you may not think much of it. It feels ordinary, even forgettable. But after hearing it again and again on the radio, in the car, or in a cafe, something begins to change. Suddenly, the song feels familiar, comfortable, even enjoyable. You might even start humming along without realizing it. This is not just coincidence. It's a powerful psychological phenomenon known as the mere exposure effect, the tendency for people to develop a preference for things simply because they are familiar. The mere exposure effect was first systematically studied by social psychologist Robert Zajonc in the 1960s. In a series of experiments, Zajonc showed participants unfamiliar symbols, words, and even photographs of strangers. Some images were shown only once, while others were repeated several times. The results were clear. The more often participants saw something, the more they reported liking it. Repetition alone, even without conscious recognition, created a sense of comfort and positivity. Why does this happen? On a biological level, the brain equates familiarity with safety. For our ancestors, new and unfamiliar things often carried risks. New foods might be poisonous. New environments might be dangerous. Familiarity, on the other hand, signaled that something had been encountered before without harm. Over time, our brains evolved to associate repeated exposure with trustworthiness and safety. This instinct still guides us today, even in contexts where danger isn't present. The mere exposure effect explains many aspects of daily life. It's why brands spend millions on advertising, ensuring you see their logos repeatedly, even when you're not consciously paying attention. The more often you see a brand, the more positively you feel toward it, even if you've never used its products. It's why political candid. The impact of the mere exposure effect can also be seen in culture and society. Consider how language, art, or even fashion trends spread. Something unusual at first may seem strange, even unattractive. But as it's repeated, through media, social networks, or public presence. It begins to feel normal, even appealing. This explains how styles that once seemed bizarre become mainstream. Repetition normalizes, and normalization creates acceptance. Marketers, advertisers, and politicians have long exploited this principle. Repetition is at the core of slogans, jingles, and branding. The more often we see a symbol, hear a phrase, or encounter a product, the more it sinks into our subconscious. Even if we don't consciously recall the exposure, our brains log it, and familiarity creates a subtle preference. This is why the phrase top of mind is so valuable in business. The more often something appears in your awareness, the more likely you are to choose it later. The mere exposure effect also sheds light on why change can be so difficult. New ideas, technologies, or policies often meet resistance, not because they are bad, but because they are unfamiliar. People cling to what they know even if it's flawed, because familiarity feels safe. Over time, however, repeated exposure to new ideas can shift public opinion. Concepts that once seemed radical or unsettling gradually become acceptable as they are encountered more often. In this way, exposure is not only about personal preference, it is also a force that shapes cultural evolution. Critics of the mere exposure effect sometimes argue that it oversimplifies human preference. After all, not everything becomes likable through exposure, and some things may remain neutral no matter how many times we see them. But the robust body of research on the effect shows that, in many cases, familiarity is a surprisingly strong predictor of speed dating findings. Speed dating, an invention of the late 1990s, was meant to simplify the complexities of love into a rapid-fire format. A series of short, face-to-face interactions, usually lasting no more than 4 to 6 minutes, after which participants decide whether they'd like to see the person again. On the surface, it seems like a playful, efficient way to meet people, almost like shopping for a partner in miniature conversations. But what researchers soon realized was that this setting offered far more than just a dating shortcut. It created a living laboratory for studying attraction, choice, and human psychology. The speed dating findings that have emerged over the years have revealed truths about love, desire, and decision-making that go far deeper than romance alone. One of the earliest discoveries is that people believe they know what they want in a partner, but in practice, their choices often tell a different story. In surveys before speed dating events, participants confidently list traits they are looking for: intelligence, kindness, a sense of humor, stability. But when the actual dates happen, many ignore their stated preferences and instead choose partners based on other cues: chemistry, body language, voice, or simply a fleeting feeling of connection. Psychologists call this the attitude-behavior gap, the difference between what we say we want and what we actually choose. Researchers studying speed dating have also found that physical attractiveness plays a larger role than most people are willing to admit. Both men and women rank personality traits as more important than looks when asked. Yet in speed dating rounds, physical attractiveness is one of the strongest predictors of who gets chosen. This doesn't mean personality doesn't matter. It does, especially in long-term relationships. But in the high-pressure, rapid setting of speed dating, FIRS, the speed dating format has also highlighted how quickly people form impressions. Within the first few seconds of a conversation, participants begin making judgments about intelligence, kindness, confidence, or compatibility. These snap judgments often stick, even if the conversation lasts several minutes. Psychologists call this the thin slice phenomenon, the idea that people can form surprisingly strong impressions from very small slices of behavior. While sometimes accurate, these impressions are often biased by superficial factors like appearance, posture, or nervousness. Beyond attraction, speed dating findings reveal something profound about choice overload. When people are presented with too many potential partners in one evening, they often struggle to make decisions. The paradox of choice kicks in. With too many options, people become less satisfied with their selections, worrying that they may have missed out on someone better. This effect mirrors modern online dating, where endless swiping creates fatigue and dissatisfaction, even when good matches are available. Too much choice, ironically, can make finding happiness harder. Speed dating research also sheds light on long-term compatibility. Follow-up studies often track which matches go on to form relationships, and the results show that initial sparks don't always predict lasting connections. Sometimes, the people who seemed most attractive in the short rounds faded quickly once real-life compatibility came into play. On the other hand, people who weren't instant standouts sometimes built deeper, more meaningful relationships over time. This finding challenges the cultural obsession with instant chemistry, reminding us that true connection often requires more than a few minutes. The deeper message of the speed dating findings is that human attraction is complex, messy, and not fully under our conscious control. At its core, the speed dating research isn't just about romance. It's about how humans navigate choice, uncertainty, and connection. It reveals our biases, our contradictions, and our yearning for validation. It shows that while attraction can be sparked in seconds, real relationships take much longer to unfold. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that even in an age of speed and efficiency, the mysteries of love remain beautifully resistant to control. So the next time you think you know exactly what you want in a partner, remember the lesson of speed dating. What we say and what we choose don't always match. Our hearts are shaped by forces larger than conscious thought, by context, by instinct, by the invisible currents of psychology. Love is not a formula, and connection cannot be rushed. It must be lived moment by moment, choice by choice, beyond the stopwatch and beyond the table. Matching hypothesis. When it comes to love and relationships, people often talk about finding the one, someone uniquely suited to them in looks, personality, and values. Romantic movies suggest that love is about destiny, where opposites attract and magical chemistry overrides everything else. But psychology tells a different story, one that is less about fantasy and more about patterns. One of the most enduring ideas in social psychology is the matching hypothesis, the notion that people are more likely to form and maintain relationships with others who are similar to them in terms of physical attractiveness, social standing, or other valued traits. At first glance, the matching hypothesis may sound unromantic. It suggests that we don't necessarily chase after the most attractive or most ideal partner available. Instead, we gravitate toward those who match us in perceived value. In other words, people tend to pair up with others who are in their league. This doesn't mean couples look identical, or that love is reduced to numbers. It means there's a balancing mechanism at work. The relationships that endure are often those where partners feel equally matched, where the scales of attractiveness, status, or qualities feel roughly even. The origins of this idea can be traced back to the 1960s, when researchers like Elaine Hatfield and her colleagues began studying dating behaviors. In one famous study, students were randomly paired for a dance event. The researchers wanted to know what would predict whether participants enjoyed the date and wanted to see their partner again. Surprisingly, the single strongest predictor was physical attractiveness. But when the researchers dug deeper into real-world relationships, they noticed something different. People were not all chasing the most attractive partners. Instead, they tended to pair with people who were about as attractive, vide as themselves. Why does this happen? One explanation is fear of rejection. People intuitively recognize that pursuing someone far outside their perceived league carries a higher risk of rejection. Instead of chasing the most attractive partner possible, many settle into relationships where their chances of acceptance are higher. Another explanation is reciprocal liking. We are drawn to people who like us back. If someone shows interest in us, that validation makes them more appealing, and relationships are more likely to form where interest is mutual. Matching ensures that balance. But the matching hypothesis isn't just about physical appearance. Over time, researchers have expanded the idea to include other traits: social status, education, values, and even personality. Couples often match on socioeconomic background, cultural traditions, or lifestyle preferences. While there are exceptions, like partners from very different backgrounds, the general pattern is that similarity creates stability. When people feel matched, there is less insecurity, less competition, and more harmony. Interestingly, the hypothesis also explains why highly attractive people don't always end up together. Instead, balance emerges in different ways. A person who is very attractive might pair with someone less attractive physically, but who has high status, wealth, or charisma. In this way, different forms of value balance each other out. This is sometimes called asset matching, where one partner's qualities compensate for the others. It may not always be consciously calculated, but it reflects the subtle negotiations people make in relationships, seeking partners where the exchange feels fair. Critics of the matching hypothesis argue that it oversimplifies love, reducing relationships to a kind of marketplace. And it's true, love is more than math. There are countless stories of couples who defy expectations, where partners differ greatly in attractiveness or status, yet build strong, lasting bonds. But even in those cases, other forms of matching often emerge. Emotional compatibility, shared humor, or aligned values may act as the glue. Matching doesn't mean identical, it means balance, however that balance is achieved. The matching hypothesis also reveals something about human self-perception. People often choose partners based on how they see themselves, not just on how others see them. Someone with high self-esteem may feel entitled to pursue more attractive partners. Someone insecure may settle for less, even if they could aim higher. This suggests that self-image plays a crucial role in who we end up with. In many ways, the matching hypothesis is less about objective reality and more about subjective perception. Who do we believe is in our league, and who do we believe will accept us? Real-world examples of the matching hypothesis can be seen everywhere. High school couples often pair within the same social circles, not necessarily with the most attractive classmates, but with those whose status aligns. In online dating, studies show that people are most likely to send messages to others who are similar to them in attractiveness and popularity on the platform. Even in marriages, research has found that couples often converge in attractiveness, education, and background, reflecting a balance that feels sustainable over time. But there's also a hopeful side to the matching hypothesis. It challenges the cultural myth that only the most attractive, wealthy, or charismatic people find love. Instead, it suggests that fulfillment comes from balance, from finding someone whose strengths complement ours and whose presence feels secure. Love is not a competition for the best partner. It's about connection with someone who fits with us. The hypothesis reframes romance as less about leagues and more about harmony. There are deeper implications, too. If people generally match in relationships, it may explain why inequality in societies can lead to relationship tensions. When wealth or status gaps widen, matching becomes more difficult, and conflicts over who deserves who increase. On the flip side, when societies are more equal, relationships may feel more stable, as matching happens more naturally. At its heart, the matching hypothesis isn't a cynical view of love, it's a realistic one. It acknowledges that attraction and relationships are influenced by both biology and psychology, by both desire and pragmatism. It reminds us that while passion sparks, balance sustains. A relationship isn't just about chasing the ideal, it's about finding someone whose presence feels equal, whose value feels shared, and whose acceptance feels mutual. The matching hypothesis teaches us that love is less about chasing perfection and more about finding equilibrium. It's about the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you are with someone who sees you as their equal, someone who matches you in ways that matter most. And in the end, perhaps that balance, not fantasy, not idealization, is what gives relationships their strength and longevity. Misattribution of arousal. Imagine standing on a suspension bridge that sways with every step. Your palms sweat, your heart races, your breathing quickens. Now imagine, in that same moment, someone smiles at you, flirts, or sparks a conversation. Suddenly, you feel a surge of attraction, a powerful pull you may not otherwise have felt. But here's the twist. What if that attraction wasn't about the person at all? What if it was your fear, your adrenaline, your body's heightened state of arousal, mistakenly interpreted as romance or desire? This is the fascinating psychological phenomenon known as misattribution of arousal. The idea was famously demonstrated in the Bridge study by psychologists Donald Dutton and Arthur Aron in 1974. Male participants encountered an attractive female experimenter either on a shaky, high suspension bridge or on a stable, low bridge. After completing a short survey, the men were given her phone number. Those who met her on the shaky bridge were not only more likely to call later, but also wrote more sexually charged stories in response to a creative writing task. The conclusion was striking. Their heightened physiological arousal from the fear-inducing bridge had been misattributed to attraction toward the woman. At the core of misattribution of arousal lies the two-factor theory of emotion, proposed by psychologists Stanley Schachter and Jerome Singer. According to this theory, emotions are the product of two components: physiological arousal, the body's physical response, and cognitive interpretation, the story we tell ourselves about why we feel that way. The body reacts first, heart racing, sweating, trembling, and then the mind scrambles to explain it. Often we assign that arousal to whatever is most salient in the moment, even if it isn't the real cause. This principle explains why emotions can be so easily confused. The same racing here firm. Art can be interpreted as fear, excitement, anger, or love, depending on context. In the bridge study, fear was reinterpreted as attraction, but in daily life, misattribution of arousal can happen in countless ways. Think about couples on roller coasters, watching horror movies, or going on thrilling adventures. The adrenaline from the activity amplifies feelings of connection. What might have been a casual bond can feel like passion because the body's signals are mistakenly linked to the person beside you. Misattribution of arousal also explains why arguments in relationships sometimes spark intense reconciliations. After a heated fight, with adrenaline still pumping, couples may experience equally intense moments of passion. The physiological arousal, raised heartbeat, heightened energy, is reinterpreted, shifting from anger to desire. The body doesn't neatly separate emotions, it simply signals arousal, and the mind attaches meaning based on the situation. But the phenomenon extends beyond romance. Athletes often reinterpret pre-game jitters as excitement, reframing anxiety into motivation. Public speakers may channel stage fright into energy, convincing themselves that their racing heart is anticipation rather than terror. In both cases, the misattribution of arousal becomes a tool for performance, transforming fear into fuel. However, misattribution can also mislead us. Sometimes we confuse stress or anxiety with attraction. A person who consistently causes tension or chaos may seem exciting because our bodies react strongly around them, but the attraction may not be genuine. It's the arousal being misinterpreted. This is why some people mistake toxic or unstable relationships for passionate ones. The intensity is real, but the interpretation is flawed. The implications of this phenomenon stretch into advertising, entertainment, and even politics. Action-packed commercials or high-energy rallies often stir physiological arousal, which audiences may then associate with the product, leader, or cause being presented. The context of excitement or intensity transfers to the subject at hand, creating positive associations not because of logic, but because of misattributed emotion. Critics of the bridge study and related experiments have pointed out that arousal is not always so easily redirected. Context matters. Not every adrenaline spike turns into attraction, and not every stressful situation heightens desire. Still, decades of research support the idea that arousal is fluid, and its interpretation is often flexible. The brain does not always know exactly why the body is reacting, so it fills in the blanks with the most available explanation. This raises fascinating questions about how much control we really have over our feelings. If a significant portion of our emotional experience is shaped by misattributed arousal, then emotions may be less about truth and more about interpretation. Love at first sight might sometimes be adrenaline at first sight. Fear might sometimes masquerade as excitement. Stress might sometimes feel like passion. The boundary between emotions is thinner than we think. And yet, there is a hopeful lesson here. If emotions are partly constructed, then we have the power to shape them. By reframing arousal as excitement instead of fear, we can perform better, love deeper, and experience life more fully. Couples who share adventures may feel closer, not just because of compatibility, but because adrenaline binds them together. Individuals who reinterpret anxiety as anticipation may thrive in challenges instead of shrinking from them. Misattribution of arousal is not just a quirk of the mind, it is a cue. Well, that, when understood, can be harnessed. But it is also a warning. Attraction born from intensity does not always last. Once the adrenaline fades, the underlying connection, or lack of it, becomes clear. The bridge study men may have called the experimenter, but long-term relationships are not built on shaky bridges alone. Real compatibility requires more than adrenaline. It requires values, trust, and shared meaning. At its core, the misattribution of arousal teaches us something profound about human experience. Emotions are not fixed realities, but stories we tell ourselves about bodily signals. The body reacts first, the mind interprets later, and sometimes the interpretation is wrong. Understanding this truth can help us navigate love, fear, and passion with greater awareness. So the next time your heart races and your breath quickens, pause. Ask yourself, what am I really feeling? Is this fear disguised as excitement, stress mistaken for love, or anxiety reimagined as thrill? The answer might surprise you, because sometimes the difference between terror and desire, between hesitation and courage, is not in the body at all, but in the story the mind chooses to tell. Self-perception theory. Imagine sitting at a cafe. You're halfway through your coffee when a friend leans across the table and asks you, "Do you like jazz?" You pause for a moment. You don't have a strong opinion about jazz, or maybe you've never really thought about it before. Instead of searching deep within for an answer, you reflect on your own behavior. You think, well, I've been to a couple of jazz concerts, I usually enjoy them, and I sometimes play jazz playlists when I study. I guess I must like jazz. This is the essence of self-perception theory. The idea that when we're unsure about our attitudes, emotions, or preferences, we infer them by observing our own behavior, much like an outsider would. Proposed by psychologist Daryl Bem in the 1960s, self-perception theory challenged the traditional view that attitudes drive behavior. Instead, it suggested the opposite can also be true. Behavior can shape attitudes. We don't always act because we know how we feel. Sometimes we figure out how we feel because of how we act. It's a subtle but revolutionary shift in understanding the human mind. Consider another example. Imagine someone who volunteers regularly at an animal shelter. Over time, if asked whether they care deeply about animal welfare, they may reflect on their consistent volunteering and conclude, yes, I must be the kind of person who values animals. Their behavior becomes evidence for their identity. Similarly, someone who notices they smile and laugh often around a particular friend may conclude, I must really enjoy this person's company. The emotion is inferred from the action. One of the most famous demonstrations of self-perception theory comes from experiments on facial expressions. In one study, participants were asked to hold a pen between their teeth, forcing their facial muscles into something resembling a smile, or between their lips, forcing a frown. Those who were, in effect, smiling reported feeling happier and found cartoons funnier than those who were frowning. The body's behavior, smiling or frowning, shaped the perception of mood. We don't just smile when we're happy. Sometimes we feel happy because we smile. This has enormous implications for how we understand emotions. Traditional wisdom suggests we first feel something internally, then express it outwardly. But self-perception theory flips that script. Sometimes, expression precedes awareness. Sometimes, we discover how we feel by watching ourselves act. This perspective helps explain why certain techniques, like fake it till you make it, can actually work. Acting confident, even when we don't feel it, can lead us to interpret our behavior as genuine confidence, gradually shaping our internal state to match. The theory also explains why commitments and small behaviors can shift attitudes over time. For instance, when people publicly support a cause, even in small ways like signing a petition, they are more likely to internalize that support and later feel strongly about it. By observing themselves taking action, they conclude, I must care about this issue. This is one reason why advertisers and movements often start with small asks, because even minor behaviors can snowball into stronger attitudes. But self-perception theory isn't limited to positive change. It also sheds light on how people can misinterpret or distort their feelings. Take relationships, for example. Someone might interpret their willingness to spend time with a partner as evidence of deep affection, even if what they're really experiencing is comfort or habit. Conversely, someone who notices they avoid spending time with a friend may conclude that the friendship isn't meaningful, even if other factors, like stress or busyness, are at play. Our observations of our own actions are powerful, but they can also mislead us. The theory also intersects with motivation. Psychologists distinguish between intrinsic motivation, doing something because you enjoy it, and extrinsic motivation, doing it for rewards or pressure. Self-perception theory suggests that when external rewards are too strong, people may reinterpret their behavior as being driven by the reward, not by enjoyment. For example, if a child loves drawing but then starts getting paid for it, they may begin to think, I draw because of the money, rather than I draw because I love it. Over time, this shift can undermine intrinsic motivation. The behavior is still there, but the interpretation of why it happens changes, and so does the meaning. Self-perception theory also connects to how people build their identities. We often define ourselves not by looking inward, but by reflecting outward. I am someone who runs because I run every morning. I am someone who values knowledge because I spend hours reading. I am someone who cares about the environment because I recycle and volunteer. Our identities in this sense are constructed stories we tell ourselves, pieced together from our own actions. This theory has been tested in countless experiments and contexts. In politics, for example, people who wear a campaign button or attend a rally often become more committed to the cause afterward. In health psychology, people who start exercising just to try it may gradually adopt the identity of being fitness-oriented because they observe themselves sticking with the habit. In relationships, couples who engage in small acts of kindness toward each other often report feeling more in love, not because the feelings created the actions, but because the actions reinforce the feelings. Critics of the theory argue that it oversimplifies human emotions. Sometimes people do have clear inner feelings that drive behavior, and not all emotions are constructed from observation. Intense experiences like grief, fear, or rage often erupt from within, not from watching ourselves act. But even critics admit that in situations where attitudes are ambiguous or weak, self-perception theory provides a powerful explanation for how we come to understand ourselves. The beauty of this theory lies in its empowering message. If our behaviors help shape our attitudes, then changing what we do can gradually change what we feel. Don't feel confident? Act confidently. Don't feel generous? Start giving in small ways. Don't feel motivated? Take action anyway, and let your behavior tell the story. Over time, your mind will look back on your actions and decide, this is who I am. At its heart, self-perception theory reveals that our identities are not fixed. They are flexible, constructed, and constantly reshaped by our choices. We are not only thinkers who act, but actors who think. Every gesture, every routine, every small action becomes a thread in the story of who we are. The more we act in alignment with who we want to be, the more we become that person. So the next time you wonder about your feelings, whether you're happy, confident, or passionate, don't just look inward. Look at what you do. Because sometimes the clearest mirror of the self is not in thought or emotion, but in action. And from those actions, our identities take shape, one behavior at a time. False consensus effect. Picture this. You're in a group discussion, and the topic of conversation turns to something simple, like whether pineapple belongs on pizza. You casually say, "Of course it does. Who doesn't like pineapple on pizza?" You assume that most people agree with you, but then the room falls silent, and suddenly half the group looks at you in disbelief. At that moment, you realize something strange. What you thought was the obvious majority view might actually be a minority opinion. That tendency to believe our own thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors are more common and more widely shared than they really are is called the false consensus effect. The false consensus effect is a cognitive bias where people overestimate how much others think and act like they do. It's the belief that our choices, preferences, and values are normal and representative of the majority, when in reality, they may be unique or specific to our group. Psychologists first studied this phenomenon in the late 1970s, when Lee Ross and his colleagues conducted experiments that revealed just how deeply ingrained this bias is. In one study, participants were asked to choose between carrying a sign around campus that said, "Eat at Joe's," or refusing to do so. After making their decision, they were asked to estimate what percentage of other students would make the same choice. Those who agreed to carry the sign assumed most others would also agree, while those who refused assumed most others would refuse. In other words, each group projected its own behavior onto the majority. No matter what choice they made, they believed their choice was the popular one. Why does this happen? One reason is egocentrism. We see the world through the lens of our own experiences and assume others must see it the same way. Another reason is selective exposure. We surround ourselves with people who think and act similarly, whether in our families, friend circles, or online communities. This creates an echo chamber where our beliefs feel universal because everyone around us shares them. The false consensus effect thrives in these bubbles, making us think, if my group feels this way, everyone else must too. This bias also serves a psychological function. Believing that others agree with us boosts our self-esteem and validates our choices. It feels uncomfortable to think that we're isolated in our views, so the mind defaults to assuming consensus. When you say, "Everyone thinks this way," what you're really saying is, "I don't want to feel alone in thinking this way." The false consensus effect comforts us with the illusion of agreement, even when reality says otherwise. But the consequences of this bias can be serious. In social interactions, it can lead to misunderstandings. For example, a person who believes their sense of humor is widely shared may make a joke they think is harmless, only to offend others. In relationships, partners may assume their values or preferences are obvious, neglecting to communicate because they believe the other person must feel the same way. In politics, the false consensus effect can make people overestimate the popularity of their candidate or ideology, leading to shock when elections turn out differently. Social media amplifies this effect dramatically. Platforms often show us content that aligns with our interests and beliefs, creating the illusion that our perspective is the dominant one. A person scrolling through their feed may feel that everyone agrees with their stance, when in fact, they are only seeing a carefully curated slice of the world. This digital echo chamber makes the false consensus effect stronger than ever, fueling polarization and division as groups grow more convinced that their views are universally shared. The false consensus effect also influences business and marketing. A company executive may assume that because they and their colleagues like a product idea, the general public will too. This assumption can lead to costly failures when reality doesn't match expectations. Similarly, in everyday life, people may believe that their preferences, whether in food, fashion, or lifestyle, are more common than they actually are, only to be surprised when they encounter diversity of thought. Psychologists have also found that the false consensus effect is stronger when the behavior or belief is tied to identity. If a decision feels central to who we are even more likely to assume others share it. For example, someone who is passionate about environmentalism may assume that most people care about climate change, while someone who dismisses it may assume the opposite, that most people don't really care. Each side feels validated by its own echo chamber, and each overestimates its reach. What makes this bias especially powerful is how it shapes conflict. If we believe our view is the majority, we may dismiss opposing views as extreme or fringe. This makes compromise harder because both sides assume they represent what most people want. It creates a distorted perception of reality, where each group feels more popular and justified than it really is. The false consensus effect doesn't just skew perception, it reinforces division. Yet, this bias also holds a subtle lesson. The world is far more diverse than we often realize. Just because something feels obvious to us doesn't mean it is obvious to everyone. Our experiences shape our worldview, but they are not the whole picture. Recognizing this fact can make us more humble, more curious, and more open to listening. To counter the false consensus effect, psychologists suggest deliberately seeking out diverse perspectives. Step outside the echo chamber, ask questions, and expose yourself to people with different experiences. Instead of assuming consensus, invite disagreement. In personal relationships, practice clear communication instead of assuming your partner or friends think the same way. In politics or business, remember that your circle is not the whole world. What feels normal to you may be rare to others. At its core, the false consensus effect reveals both the beauty and the danger of being human. We long for connection, for the reassurance that others think and feel as we do, but this longing can blind us to difference, creating illusions of universality where none exist. The bias comforts us, but it also misleads us. So the next time you think, "Everyone must agree with this," pause. Ask yourself, is that really true, or is it just my perspective echoed back to me? The answer may surprise you. Because the world is not a mirror, it is a mosaic, made up of countless beliefs, experiences, and voices. And the sooner we recognize that, the closer we come to understanding others as they truly are, not just as reflections of ourselves. Spotlight effect. Imagine walking into a crowded room, balancing a cup of coffee in your hand. As you move through the doorway, your sleeve catches, and the drink spills down the front of your shirt. Instantly, your face burns with embarrassment. You're convinced every pair of eyes is locked on you, judging, laughing, whispering about your clumsiness. But here's the truth. Most people didn't notice. And those who did probably forgot within minutes. What you experienced was not reality. It was the spotlight effect, the psychological phenomenon where we overestimate how much attention others are paying to us. The spotlight effect is rooted in our self-centered perspective. Each of us lives in the center of our own story. We wake up inside our own head, narrate our own lives, and filter the world through our personal experience. Naturally, we assume others are paying just as much attention to us as we are to ourselves. But in reality, they're caught up in their own spotlights too. They're busy worrying about their own mistakes, their own appearance, their own lives. Psychologists Thomas Gilovich and Kenneth Savitsky coined the term in the late 1990s through a series of clever experiments. In one study, they asked college students to wear embarrassing t-shirts, featuring images like Barry Manilow, a singer the participants thought would make them look foolish, to class. Afterward, the students estimated how many of their peers noticed the shirt. The actual number was dramatically lower than what the students believed. The participants were convinced the spotlight was on them, when in reality, most people barely paid attention. This illusion of being watched extends far beyond clothing mishaps. People often believe their nervousness during a presentation is more obvious than it really is. They think their mistakes in a conversation stand out more than they do. They assume that. Isn't it when they trip on the sidewalk? Everyone is laughing. But the truth is simple. Most people are too preoccupied with themselves to dwell on us. The spotlight we feel is often a trick of the mind. Why does this happen? One explanation is egocentric bias. Since we experience our own thoughts and feelings so vividly, it's hard to step outside of them. We forget that other people aren't focused on us in the same way. Another reason is social anxiety. Our evolutionary wiring makes us hypersensitive to how we're perceived, because belonging to a group was once essential for survival. In our ancestors' world, standing out could mean rejection, and rejection could mean danger. Today, those survival instincts linger, making us feel that others are constantly watching, even when they're not. The spotlight effect also influences the way we behave socially. Many people hold back from speaking up in meetings, dancing at a party, or expressing their true selves because they fear judgment. They imagine all eyes will be on them, magnifying every mistake. But in reality, most people are too focused on themselves to notice, let alone remember. The fear of being watched often prevents us from living fully, even though the audience in our heads is largely imaginary. This bias can also create unnecessary shame. Someone who stumbles over words in a conversation may replay it endlessly in their mind, convinced that everyone noticed their awkwardness. In truth, most people likely forgot it moments later. Similarly, someone who makes a small mistake at work may feel like it defines their reputation, while colleagues barely register it. The spotlight effect magnifies our flaws, making them feel monumental when they are, in reality, fleeting. Yet, there's another side to this phenomenon. It can also amplify positive illusions. Just as we believe others notice our mistakes, we also believe they notice our achievements more than they do. A person who gives a strong presentation may assume it left a lasting impression on everyone in the room, when in reality, it may have been quickly overshadowed by the next speaker. In both directions, the spotlight distorts reality, exaggerating how much we stand out in others' minds. Understanding the spotlight effect can be liberating. Once we realize that people are not watching us as closely as we think, we can start to live with more freedom. That embarrassing t-shirt, most won't notice. That nervous stumble, most won't care. The pressure we feel is largely self-imposed. Recognizing this truth allows us to take risks, to try new things, to step into the spotlight with less fear, because the spotlight, in reality, is far dimmer than we imagine. The concept also connects to self-compassion. When we recognize that our flaws aren't as visible as we think, we can forgive ourselves more easily. We can let go of the endless replay of mistakes and remember that most people are too busy replaying their own. Realizing this creates a kind of shared humanity. Everyone is walking around thinking the spotlight is on them, when really, everyone else is thinking the same thing. The spotlight effect also highlights the importance of perspective taking. If we can step outside our own minds and recognize that others are not obsessing over us, we can reduce anxiety and build confidence. For example, public speaking feels terrifying because we imagine the audience scrutinizing every word. But in reality, most audiences are supportive, distracted, or simply thinking about what they'll have for lunch. When we internalize this truth, performing becomes easier. There's even a deeper lesson here. about freedom. Much of our behavior is constrained by the imagined gaze of others. We hold ourselves back because we think people are watching, when in truth, they're not. The spotlight effect reminds us that life is not a performance on a stage, but a shared experience where everyone is too busy with their own script to memorize ours. When we understand that, we can stop living for an imaginary audience and start living for ourselves. So the next time you feel embarrassed, humiliated, or self-conscious, pause and remind yourself, the spotlight is not as bright as it feels. People are not analyzing you as closely as you think. They're caught in their own worlds, worrying about their own mistakes, their own insecurities, their own lives. And just as you are your own main character, so is everyone else. The spotlight effect is both humbling and empowering. Humbling because it reminds us that we are not the center of the universe. Empowering because it frees us from the prison of imagined judgment. It teaches us that life is too short to waste worrying about how much others notice us. Because the truth is, they don't, not nearly as much as we think. Imposter syndrome studies. Imagine landing your dream job, the one you've worked years for. You walk into the office, shake hands with your new colleagues, and take a seat at your desk. But instead of pride, what floods your mind is fear. They made a mistake hiring me. I'm not as good as they think I am. Any day now, they'll figure it out. This is the silent voice of imposter syndrome, a psychological pattern where high-achieving individuals doubt their accomplishments and fear being exposed as frauds. What makes it so insidious is that even in the face of success, recognition, or evidence of competence, the feeling lingers. I don't belong here. The term imposter phenomenon was first coined in 1978 by psychologists Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes. They studied high-achieving women who, despite their accomplishments, felt a deep sense of intellectual fraudulence. These women attributed their success not to ability, but to luck, timing, or others' overestimation of their competence. Over time, research revealed that imposter feelings are not limited to women. They affect people across gender, race, profession, and culture. Studies estimate that as many as 70% of individuals experience imposter feelings at some point in their lives. What makes imposter syndrome fascinating is that it often strikes those who are objectively capable. Doctors, lawyers, artists, scientists, entrepreneurs, even students in elite universities, all report feeling like they are faking it. In fact, the higher someone climbs, the stronger the pressure becomes, and the louder the voice of self-doubt grows. Success does not silence it. Success often amplifies it. One of the key findings from imposter syndrome research is the disconnect between external achievements and internal beliefs. A person may have degrees, awards, or promotions, yet still feel undeserving. Psychologists explain this through cognitive distortions. Imposters dismiss their achievements as flukes, attribute success to external factors, and exaggerate mistakes while minimizing strengths. It is not the absence of success that defines imposter syndrome. It is the inability to internalize success. Studies have also revealed different tiers of imposters. The perfectionist feels like a fraud because their work is never good enough. The expert believes they must know everything before they are qualified. The natural genius thinks that struggling or needing effort means they are not truly capable. The soloist feels they must achieve on their own, and asking for help proves incompetence. The superperson measures worth by working harder than everyone else. These categories reflect different ways imposter feelings manifest, but all share the same core, the fear of being unmasked as inadequate. One experiment that highlights imposter feelings involved graduate students asked to reflect on their academic abilities compared to peers. Many who scored in the top percentiles still reported believing they were less intelligent than classmates. Another study with medical students found that imposter feelings were linked to burnout, anxiety, and depression, even when performance metrics showed excellence. The irony is that those who feel like imposters are often the ones performing above average. Their fear is not rooted in reality, but in distorted self-perception. The workplace has become a major focus of imposter syndrome studies. Employees who struggle with these feelings often hesitate to speak up in meetings, turn down opportunities, or overwork to compensate for their perceived inadequacy. Leaders and managers may hide behind masks of confidence, terrified that any mistake will reveal their fraudulence. What's striking is that organizations rarely notice. imposters blend in, appearing successful on the outside, while silently struggling within. Research also shows that imposter feelings thrive in environments of comparison and competition. For example, students at prestigious universities often report stronger imposter experiences than those at less selective schools. The reason? Surrounded by equally talented peers, they no longer stand out and begin to question whether they truly belong. This comparison trap fuels the cycle. The more successful the environment, the more likely imposters emerge. Interestingly, studies have linked imposter syndrome to personality traits. Perfectionism, neuroticism, and low self-esteem correlate strongly with imposter feelings. But culture also plays a role. In collectivist societies, where group harmony is valued, people may downplay personal achievements to avoid standing out, which can mimic or amplify imposter feelings. In individualist cultures, where success is highly prized, the pressure to achieve can feed the fear of not measuring up. There is, however, a paradoxical silver lining in imposter syndrome research. While these feelings are distressing, some studies suggest they may drive individuals to work harder, prepare more thoroughly, and remain humble. Imposter thoughts can act as fuel, pushing people to excel. But the cost is high: chronic anxiety, stress, and burnout. The energy imposters spend overcompensating for imagined inadequacy could be better spent on creativity, growth, and genuine confidence. So, how do people overcome imposter syndrome? Research points to several strategies. First is awareness. Simply knowing that imposter feelings are common can reduce their power. Second is reframing failure and effort. Instead of seeing mistakes as proof of incompetence, learning to view them as part of growth helps break the cycle. Third is external validation, seeking mentorship, feedback, and support to counter distorted self-perceptions. Perhaps most importantly, studies show that talking openly about imposter feelings helps normalize them. When people realize others share the same doubts, the illusion of isolation dissolves. One of the most powerful findings in imposter syndrome studies is that even the most accomplished people feel it. Maya Angelou, despite writing multiple best-selling books, admitted, "I have written 11 books, but each time I think, they're going to find out now, I've run a game on everybody." Albert Einstein reportedly described himself as an involuntary swindler, doubting the value of his work. These confessions remind us that imposter feelings are not a sign of weakness, but a sign of humanity. The studies also highlight the importance of shifting focus from perfection to progress. Imposter feelings often stem from the belief that competence means flawlessness. But the reality of human achievement is messier. Growth requires mistakes, and true mastery requires vulnerability. Those who overcome imposter syndrome don't silence self-doubt entirely. They learn to act in spite of it. At its core, imposter syndrome studies reveal a universal truth. Success does not always bring confidence. Sometimes, the higher we climb, the more fragile we feel. But understanding the science behind these feelings offers a path forward. It teaches us that doubt does not equal fraudulence, that fear does not erase competence, and that belonging is not something granted, it is something claimed. So the next time you feel like an imposter, remember, you are not alone. The fear that you don't belong is shared by millions, even the most accomplished among us. And the very fact that you question yourself may be evidence not of fraudulence, but of awareness, humility, and growth. The spotlight of imposter syndrome may feel harsh, but it is only an illusion. Beneath it, your achievements are real, your effort is genuine, and soon, your worth is undeniable. Social comparison theory. Picture scrolling through social media late at night. You see a friend's vacation photos on a pristine beach, another friend posting about their promotion, and yet another showing off a perfect relationship. Instantly, without meaning to, you measure yourself against them. You ask, am I successful enough? Am I attractive enough? Am I happy enough? This instinct to compare ourselves with others is not new. It's as old as human existence. Psychologists call it the social comparison theory, first proposed by Leon Festinger in 1954. It explains how much of our self-perception, confidence, and even happiness comes not from objective facts, but from comparing ourselves to others. At its core, social comparison theory suggests that people have an innate drive to evaluate themselves, and when objective standards are absent, they turn to others as benchmarks. If you want to know how good you are at something, whether it's intelligence, beauty, success, or kindness, you instinctively look sideways, not inward. The comparisons you make shape your sense of identity. You don't just ask, "Am I good?" You ask, "Am I better or worse than the people around me?" Festinger identified two main types of comparisons, upward and downward. Upward comparison occurs when we compare ourselves to people we believe are better off, more successful, wealthier, smarter, more attractive. This can inspire us to grow, serving as motivation to improve, but it can also breed envy, dissatisfaction, and insecurity because the gap between where we are and where they are feels overwhelming. Downward comparison, on the other hand, happens when we compare ourselves to those who are worse off. This can boost our self-esteem, making us feel fortunate or competent, but it can also foster arrogance or complacency. Social comparison theory is not just about envy or pride, it's about survival. Throughout human history, knowing where we stood in a group determined our chances of belonging. Status shaped access to resources, mates, and protection. Our ancestors who constantly measured themselves against others may have been more likely to adapt and survive. Today, the instinct persists, but the environment has changed. Instead of comparing ourselves to a small tribe, we now compare ourselves to the entire world through digital windows, amplifying the pressure like never before. Modern research shows that constant comparison can have profound effects on mental health. Social media platforms, with their curated highlight reels, intensify upward comparison. We rarely see others' struggles. We see their best moments. As a result, people feel inadequate, believing everyone else is happier, richer, and more fulfilled. This phenomenon even has a name, the Facebook depression effect. Yet, ironically, those we envy may be comparing themselves to someone else, trapped in the same cycle of dissatisfaction. But not all comparisons are harmful. Studies show that upward comparisons, when approached with the right mindset, can fuel ambition. Athletes often train harder when they compete against stronger opponents. Students may perform better when surrounded by high-achieving peers. The key is whether comparison breeds inspiration or self-criticism. Similarly, downward comparisons can bring gratitude, reminding us of what we have. A person struggling with stress may feel relief by realizing others face even harsher challenges. But if taken too far, this can lead to complacency or a lack of empathy. Another fascinating aspect of social comparison theory is how relative success often matters more than absolute success. A person earning $70,000 a year may feel rich in a community where the average income is $50,000, but feel poor in a community where the average is $100,000. The number itself matters less than the social context. Psychologists call this relative deprivation, the feeling of being deprived not because you lack something, but because others have more. This is why, even in wealthy societies, dissatisfaction persists. Happiness is not simply about what we have. It's about how we think we measure up. The theory also explains group dynamics. In schools, workplaces, or social circles, people constantly evaluate themselves relative to peers. This can create unhealthy competition, but it can also push entire groups forward. For example, a company where employees compare themselves to high-performing colleagues may achieve greater productivity. But it can also lead to burnout if people constantly feel inadequate. Balance is critical. Research into social comparison has also revealed a paradox. Sometimes the very people we admire most are the ones who make us feel the worst. When we look at someone too far ahead of us, the comparison feels impossible, leading to despair instead of motivation. Psychologists suggest making realistic comparisons, choosing role models who are just a step ahead rather than miles away. By doing so, we can use comparison as a ladder, not a cage. Self-esteem plays a key role in how we process comparisons. People with high self-esteem are more likely to view upward comparisons positively, using them as fuel for growth. Those with low self-esteem, however, may interpret the same comparison as proof of their inadequacy. This shows that the problem isn't just comparison itself, it's the lens through which we interpret it. One powerful application of social comparison theory is in therapy and personal growth. By becoming aware of our comparison patterns, we can reshape them. Instead of unconsciously measuring ourselves against others, we can choose comparisons that inspire us and avoid those that harm us. We can also practice gratitude by reflecting on how far we've come, rather than only looking at where others are. There's also a philosophical lesson in this theory. If much of our happiness depends on how we compare ourselves to others, then perhaps happiness is less about achieving external milestones and more about mastering perspective. Two people can live identical lives, same job, same income, same relationships, and one may feel content while the other feels miserable, depending on the comparisons they make. In this way, comparison is not just a psychological process, it's a choice, whether we realize it or not. At its heart, social comparison theory reveals the fragile, relative nature of human happiness. We are not isolated beings. Our sense of worth is constantly shaped by the mirror of others. But the mirror is distorted, reflecting fragments instead of the whole. Recognizing this distortion is the first step toward freedom. When we realize that comparison is inevitable but not absolute, we gain the power to direct it, to use it as motivation rather than self-destruction. So the next time you feel inadequate scrolling through someone else's perfect life, remember, you're not seeing the whole picture. You're seeing a carefully chosen slice. The comparisons you make can lift you or break you, but ultimately, the choice is yours. The goal is not to eliminate comparison, it's to master it, to turn it from a chain into a compass. And when we do that, we reclaim the power to define ourselves not by others' standards, but by our own. Cognitive appraisal theory. Imagine two people stuck in the same traffic jam. One slams the steering wheel, muttering angrily, convinced the delay will ruin their day. The other shrugs, turns up the radio, and sees it as extra time to listen to music. The same event, the same inconvenience, yet two entirely different emotional reactions. Why? According to the cognitive appraisal theory, it's not the event itself that determines our emotions. It's the meaning we give to it. First introduced by psychologist Richard Lazarus in the 1960s, cognitive appraisal theory revolutionized the way we think about emotions. Before Lazarus, many theories suggested that emotions were automatic reactions to stimuli, almost hardwired responses to what happens around us. Lazarus argued instead that emotions are not passive, they're the result of active evaluation, or appraisal. In other words, emotions arise not simply from what happens, but from how we interpret what happens. Think of it like this. Events are neutral until we assign them meaning. You don't feel anxious simply because you're giving a speech. You feel anxious because you appraise the speech as threatening, fearing embarrassment, or failure. You don't feel joy just because you see a friend. You feel joy because you interpret their presence as supportive, validating, or comforting. Emotions in this sense are deeply personal. They are constructed through the lens of our thoughts, beliefs, and interpretations. Lazarus identified two main types of appraisal: primary appraisal and secondary appraisal. In primary appraisal, we ask ourselves, is this situation relevant to me? Is it good, bad, threatening, or irrelevant? If something is appraised as irrelevant, it doesn't stir much emotion. But if it's seen as harmful or beneficial, emotions are triggered. Secondary appraisal comes next. Do I have the resources to deal with this? Can you see it? I cope? If the answer is yes, we may feel confident, motivated, or challenged. If the answer is no, we may feel fear, helplessness, or despair. Together, these appraisals shape the emotional landscape of every experience. Consider a simple example. Two students get the same grade on an exam, a C. One interprets it as failure. I'm not smart enough. This grade proves it. They feel shame, frustration, and hopelessness. The other interprets it as a challenge. I didn't prepare enough, but I can do better next time. They feel motivated, determined, maybe even relieved they didn't fail. The grade itself is identical. The emotion differs because the appraisal differs. Cognitive appraisal theory also explains why people react differently to the same life events. Job loss may devastate one person, who interprets it as catastrophic and threatening to their identity. Another may see it as an opportunity for reinvention, a chance to finally pursue something meaningful. Divorce may feel like a crushing failure to one, but like liberation to another. The event alone doesn't dictate emotion. Interpretation does. What makes this theory especially powerful is its connection to stress. Lazarus and his colleague Susan Folkman developed the transactional model of stress and coping, which built on appraisal theory. They argued that stress is not simply about external pressures, but about how we evaluate those pressures and our ability to handle them. A demanding job can feel overwhelming if appraised as unmanageable, or energizing if appraised as a test of skill. In this way, stress is not only about workload, it's about perception. Modern neuroscience supports this idea. Brain imaging studies show that the amygdala, linked to emotional reactions, responds differently depending on how a situation is framed or appraised. For example, athletes who interpret pre-competition arousal as excitement perform better, while those who interpret it as anxiety perform worse, even though their physiological state is the same. The body reacts, but the mind decides what it means. This brings us to an important implication. If emotions are shaped by appraisal, then we have some power to reshape them. This doesn't mean we can control every feeling at will. Emotions are complex and often unconscious, but we can influence them by shifting perspective. Cognitive reappraisal, a strategy used in cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is built on this principle. By reframing how we interpret situations, we can change how we feel about them. Instead of viewing rejection as proof of inadequacy, we can see it as redirection. Instead of viewing failure as defeat, we can see it as feedback. Studies show that people who practice reappraisal regularly experience less depression, less anxiety, and greater emotional resilience. In one famous experiment, participants were shown disturbing images. Those instructed to reappraise the images in a different way, for example, by imagining the scene as fictional or temporary, reported less distress. Their brains even showed reduced activity in regions associated with negative emotion. The mind's interpretation literally altered the emotional response. Cognitive appraisal theory also reveals why cultural differences in emotion exist. Different societies appraise situations in unique ways, shaped by values and norms. In some cultures, expressing anger may be appraised as strength, while in others it is appraised as disrespect. The same emotion may be praised in one context and condemned in another. Our appraisals are not just personal, they are cultural scripts that shape how entire groups respond to life. But the theory also has limits. Critics argue that not all emotions require conscious appraisal. Some reactions, like a startle response to a loud noise, occur too quickly for evaluation. Evolutionary psychologists point out that some emotions, like fear of snakes, may be hardwired rather than appraised. Still, even these automatic reactions can be shaped afterward by cognitive interpretation. You might startle at a noise, then laugh when you realize it was just the wind. The appraisal doesn't erase the reflex, but it reframes it. At a deeper level, cognitive appraisal theory challenges us to rethink what emotions really are. They are not objective truths. They are interpretations layered over raw experience. This means our emotions are not simply reactions we suffer through. They are narratives we construct. By changing the story, we can change the feeling. This doesn't mean denying pain or faking positivity, but recognizing the role our thoughts play in shaping reality. The liberating lesson here is that while we cannot control every event in life, we can shape our relationship to those events. Traffic can be torture or a break. Failure can be defeat or instruction. Loss can be devastation or transformation. The power lies not only in what happens, but in how we interpret what happens. So the next time you find yourself overwhelmed by emotion, pause and ask, what story am I telling myself about this event? What meaning am I assigning to it? Is there another way to see it? That simple act of appraisal can shift the entire emotional experience. Because emotions are not just reactions, they are reflections of the meanings we choose to give. Facial feedback hypothesis. Imagine standing in front of a mirror, forcing yourself to smile, even when you don't feel like it. At first, it seems absurd. How could curving your lips upward change the storm inside you? But then, something subtle happens. The act of smiling begins to shift your mood. The sadness feels lighter, the stress less suffocating. What you've just experienced is at the heart of the facial feedback hypothesis. The idea that our facial expressions don't just reflect our emotions, they actively shape them. The origins of this idea stretch back centuries. Charles Darwin himself hinted at it in the 19th century when he proposed that expressions can reinforce emotional experiences. In his book, The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals, Darwin suggested that the free expression of an emotion intensifies it. In other words, smiling can make us happier, and frowning can deepen our sadness. Modern psychology took this further, testing it in controlled experiments to uncover how much the face influences the mind. One of the most famous experiments on the facial feedback hypothesis was conducted by Fritz Strack and his colleagues in 1908. In their study, participants were asked to hold a pen in their mouths in two different ways, one that forced their facial muscles into a smile, teeth holding, and another that forced a pout or frown, lips holding. Afterward, participants rated how funny they found certain cartoons. The results were striking. Those smiling found the cartoons significantly funnier than those frowning. Even without realizing it, their facial muscles had shaped their emotional experience. This study became a cornerstone in psychology, cited as evidence that our expressions feed back into our emotions. The idea is simple but powerful. The act of smiling can trigger feelings of happiness, symbiosis, while the act of frowning can amplify negativity. The brain, it seems, listens to the body for cues about how to feel. However, the story doesn't end there. In recent years, replication attempts of Strack's study have produced mixed results, sparking debate about the robustness of the effect. Some researchers argue that the influence of facial expressions on emotion may depend on context, awareness, or individual differences. Still, even with controversy, the broader body of evidence continues to support the idea that expressions play a role in shaping emotions. For instance, studies using Botox, where facial muscles are temporarily paralyzed, show that individuals who cannot frown as easily also report lower levels of negative emotions, suggesting a direct link between facial feedback and mood. The facial feedback hypothesis also ties into everyday life in profound ways. Think about laughter yoga sessions, where participants gather to laugh intentionally, even without jokes. At first, the laughter is forced, but soon it becomes genuine, and participants often leave feeling lighter and happier. The same applies when we fake a smile during difficult times. Over time, the body sends signals to the brain that reinforce positivity. What begins as fake it till you make it can turn into authentic emotional change. On the flip side, negative expressions can trap us in cycles of emotion. Furrowing brows, frowning, or sighing frequently can reinforce feelings of stress, frustration, or sadness. The body and mind create a feedback loop where each strengthens the other. Becoming aware of this loop offers an opportunity. By altering the physical expression, we can interrupt the cycle and redirect the emotion. The hypothesis also extends beyond the face. Research suggests that posture and body language play similar roles in emotional experience. Standing tall with open posture can increase feelings of confidence and power, while slouching can reinforce feelings of defeat or insecurity. The principle remains consistent. The body informs the mind. Culturally, the facial feedback hypothesis has fascinating implications. In societies where smiling is frequent and encouraged, people may experience higher baseline levels of positive emotion. In cultures where stoicism is valued, emotional experiences may manifest differently. Yet, across cultures, the universality of expressions, smiles, frowns, scowls, shows that the link between face and feeling is deeply rooted in human biology. Critics caution against oversimplifying the theory. Emotions are complex, influenced by thoughts, memories, hormones, and context. A smile alone cannot erase deep grief, nor can a frown create depression. But what the facial feedback hypothesis reveals is that emotions are not one-way streets. They are dynamic conversations between body and mind. The body doesn't just respond to feelings, it helps create them. There is also a philosophical beauty in this idea. It suggests that we are not merely victims of emotion, passively carried along by inner storms. We have agency, however small, to influence how we feel by adjusting the physical signals we send to the brain. Smiling through pain doesn't mean denying the pain. It means creating space for resilience. Standing tall doesn't erase fear, but it can invite courage. Consider public speakers who use push-up poses before stepping on stage, or athletes who pump themselves up with exaggerated expressions of confidence before a competition. These rituals work not just because of psychology, but because of physiology. The face and body create emotional readiness, sending signals to the brain that say, "I am strong, I am ready." The facial feedback hypothesis also resonates in personal growth. By deliberately choosing expressions that align with who we want to be, we can gently steer our emotions in that direction. Smiling when practicing gratitude, adopting open expressions in conversations, or softening the face during conflict, these small acts can ripple into significant emotional shifts. At its deepest level, the theory teaches us that emotions are embodied experiences. They are not abstract states floating in the mind. They live in muscles, gestures, and expressions. To change how we feel, we can begin with how we move, how we hold ourselves, how we express ourselves outwardly. So the next time you feel trapped in negativity, experiment with the smallest shift: a smile, a laugh, a relaxed posture. It may not erase the struggle, but it will change the conversation between body and mind. Because sometimes, happiness doesn't begin in the heart. It begins in the muscles of the face, spreading inward until the emotion becomes real. Grit ver IQ. Centuries, society has been obsessed with the concept of intelligence. From standardized tests to prestigious academic honors, IQ has often been seen as the ultimate predictor of success. The idea is simple: the smarter you are, the further you'll go. But as time passed and real-life stories unfolded, cracks began to show in this belief. Some people with towering IQs struggled to achieve their goals, while others with average intelligence managed to build extraordinary lives. This paradox led psychologists to explore a deeper truth. Perhaps success isn't simply about how smart you are, it's about how determined you are. This is where the conversation of grit versus IQ begins. Grit, a term popularized by psychologist Angela Duckworth, is defined as the combination of passion and perseverance toward long-term goals. Unlike IQ, which measures cognitive ability, grit reflects character, the ability to push forward through obstacles, to persist when progress feels slow, to refuse to give up when others quit. Duckworth's groundbreaking research revealed that grit often outperforms raw intelligence as a predictor of achievement. Consider this. In her studies of West Point cadets, spelling bee champions, and corporate employees, Duckworth found that those who succeeded were not necessarily the most intelligent. Instead, they were the most persistent. Cadets who endured the grueling first weeks of training weren't always those with the highest test scores, but those who had the resilience to keep going, despite exhaustion and doubt. Spelling bee champions weren't just talented with words. They were the ones who practiced relentlessly, hour after hour. I gave them a foundation, but grit carried them across the finish line. This doesn't mean IQ is irrelevant. Intelligence matters. It helps us process information, solve problems, and adapt quickly. But what grit teaches us is that intelligence alone is not enough. Many brilliant minds fall short because they lack the persistence to stick with challenges. Conversely, many average minds surpass expectations because they refuse to quit. As Thomas Edison once said, genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Grit gives substance to that perspiration. It is the invisible fuel behind sustained effort. Think about athletes. Talent may give someone an early advantage, but what separates champions from the rest is their willingness to train, endure failure, and practice relentlessly when no one is watching. The same holds true in music, art, business, or science. IQ may open the door, but grit keeps you walking through it again and again, even when the path is uphill. The debate between grit and IQ also touches on how we define success. If success were solely about intelligence, life would be predictable. The smartest would always rise to the top. But history shows otherwise. Countless innovators, entrepreneurs, and leaders were not the highest scorers in school. Many were considered mediocre or even failures by traditional measures. What they had was persistence, vision, and an unwavering refusal to give up. Steve Jobs, who dropped out of college, was not measured by IQ but by passion and resilience. Oprah Winfrey overcame poverty and rejection, not because of raw cognitive ability, but because of relentless grit. Psychologists also emphasize that grit is not about never feeling tired or discouraged. Everyone feels those things. Grit is about showing up anyway. It is the ability to endure boredom, repetition, and failure in pursuit of something meaningful. IQ may sparkle in the moment, but grit is about the long haul. It transforms short-term discomfort into long-term growth. Interestingly, grit also reshapes the way we think about talent. Many people assume that talent is innate. a gift you either have or don't, but research shows that effort is what turns potential into reality. IQ may determine how quickly you learn something, but grit determines how deeply you master it. In this sense, grit multiplies talent. Talent without effort is wasted. Talent combined with grit becomes excellence. Another fascinating insight from grit research is its relationship with purpose. People with grit aren't just persistent, they are deeply connected to why they are doing what they do. Their goals are not fleeting whims, but long-term passions. Purpose sustains perseverance. Without purpose, persistence feels like punishment. With purpose, persistence feels like devotion. Critics, however, caution against over-glorifying grit. They argue that grit without direction can lead to burnout or wasted effort. Persevering blindly in the wrong path may not lead to success. Balance is key. Grit thrives when combined with self-awareness, flexibility, and strategic intelligence. The most successful people know when to persist and when to pivot. They are not stubbornly grinding at all costs, but intentionally channeling their energy into goals that align with their passions and values. The grit versus IQ debate also carries important implications for education and parenting. For decades, schools emphasize test scores as indicators of ability, but if grit predicts success more reliably, then perhaps education should also focus on resilience, discipline, and long-term goal setting. Teaching students to embrace failure, persist through difficulty, and cultivate passion may be just as important, if not more important, than teaching them to memorize facts. From a philosophical perspective, the debate asks us to reflect on what kind of life we want to live. Do we want to measure ourselves only by intelligence, by what we know and how fast we can learn? Or do we want to measure ourselves by character, by our willingness to endure, to struggle, to keep moving towards something meaningful? Grit reminds us that life is not a sprint of intelligence, but a marathon of perseverance. At its heart, the discussion of grit versus IQ teaches us a simple truth. Brilliance is admirable, but persistence is unstoppable. IQ may light the spark, but grit keeps the fire alive. It is the difference between potential and achievement, between talent and legacy. Intelligence may open the first door, but grit is what carries you through every door after that. So, the next time you doubt your abilities, remember this. You don't have to be the smartest person in the room. You only have to be the one who refuses to quit. Intelligence may give you an edge, but grit will give you the endurance to climb mountains that IQ alone could never scale. And in the end, it is not always the brightest mind that wins. It is the most determined heart. Delay of gratification. Imagine being a child sitting at a small table, staring at a single marshmallow on a plate in front of you. A researcher tells you that you can eat it now if you want, but if you wait until they return, you'll get 2 marshmallows instead. The choice is simple in theory. 1 marshmallow now or 2 later, but the reality is agonizing. The marshmallow seems to glow brighter with every second, the smell more tempting, the desire more unbearable. Some children cave in within seconds, others squirm, cover their eyes, hum songs, or even lick the marshmallow without eating it. And a few manage to wait until the researcher comes back. This famous experiment, conducted in the 1960s and 1970s by psychologist Walter Mischel at Stanford University, became known as the marshmallow test, and it's one of the most iconic demonstrations of delay of gratification, the ability to resist an immediate reward in order to gain a greater reward later. The study didn't just test self-control, it revealed something deeper about human nature and long-term success. When Mischel followed up with the children years later, he found a striking pattern. Those who had been able to wait longer for the second marshmallow tended to do better in life by many measures. They had higher SAT scores, healthier relationships, greater emotional stability, and even lower rates of substance abuse. The marshmallow wasn't just candy. It was a window into the child's ability to regulate desire, manage impulse, and think about the future. At the heart of delay of gratification lies the tension between the present self and the future self. The present self craves immediate pleasure, food, comfort, entertainment, validation. The future self wants long-term rewards, health, success, stability, fulfillment. The battle between these two selves plays out constantly in our lives. Every decision, from choosing to save money instead of spending it, to exercising instead of lounging, to studying instead of procrastinating, reflects this tug of war. Modern neuroscience offers insight into this struggle. The limbic system, an older part of the brain, drives impulses and desires for immediate rewards. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational thinking and planning, tries to weigh long-term consequences. When the prefrontal cortex is strong and engaged, people are more likely to delay gratification. When impulses overwhelm it, short-term rewards win. The marshmallow test, in this sense, reflects the biological dance between instinct and reason. But the story of delay isn't as simple as waiters succeed and non-waiters fail. Later research revealed that context matters. In environments where resources are scarce or unpredictable, it can be rational to take the marshmallow immediately. Why wait for a reward that may never come? In fact, studies have shown that children from more unstable backgrounds are less likely to wait, not because they lack willpower, but because they have learned that future rewards are uncertain. This nuance shifts the meaning of delay. It's not just about self-control, but about trust in the future. Still, the ability to delay gratification is undeniably powerful. It underpins countless achievements. Students who choose to study instead of going out with friends often reap the benefits years later. Entrepreneurs who sacrifice comfort in the present, they often build lasting businesses. Athletes who endure grueling training instead of short-term pleasure achieve excellence. Delay is not glamorous, but it is transformative. It is the quiet discipline that builds empires. The principle of delay also explains why habits are so hard to change. Immediate rewards, like the pleasure of junk food or scrolling through social media, are hard to resist because the gratification is instant. Long-term rewards, like health or knowledge, feel distant and abstract. To bridge this gap, psychologists suggest creating intermediate rewards, small, immediate gratifications that keep us motivated on the path to larger goals. This is why progress tracking, gamification, or celebrating small wins is so effective. They give the brain something now, while still pointing toward the future. Delay of gratification also ties into emotional intelligence. The ability to regulate emotions, tolerate frustration, and manage stress is what makes waiting possible. Children in the marshmallow test who distracted themselves by singing, covering their eyes, or imagining the marshmallow as something else, were practicing emotional regulation. As adults, we do the same when we find ways to focus on long-term goals, despite immediate temptations. But perhaps the most profound lesson of delay is that it's not just about willpower. It's about meaning. When people have a clear vision of the future, waiting becomes easier. If the marshmallow represents not just candy, but a better life, then the sacrifice makes sense. Purpose transforms patience. This is why people who have strong life goals or values are often better at delaying gratification. They see beyond the present moment. Critics of the marshmallow test warn against oversimplifying its message. Not every successful person always delays gratification. Sometimes seizing opportunities in the moment is the right choice. Life is not only about waiting, but also about knowing when to act. The wisdom lies in discernment. When does patience serve you? And when does it hold you back? Still, the overarching truth remains. The ability to affect heuristic. Imagine walking into a store to buy sunscreen. Two options sit on the shelf. One bottle has bright colors, a smiling sun, and the words safe, protective, trusted. The other bottle is plain, clinical, with fewer design elements. Without reading the labels closely, you instantly feel drawn to the first one. It feels safer. It feels better. But here's the key. You didn't carefully analyze the ingredients. You didn't weigh SPF ratings or chemical compositions. You made a decision based on how the product made you feel. That shortcut, where emotions override logic, is what psychologists call the affect heuristic. Coined by Paul Slovic and his colleagues in the 1980s, the affect heuristic refers to the mental shortcut where people rely on their emotions, gut feelings, immediate reactions, vibes, to make decisions, rather than engaging in slow, rational analysis. Instead of carefully weighing pros and cons, we ask ourselves, how do I feel about this? And our feelings, positive or negative, become the compass that guides our judgments. This shortcut makes sense when you think about it. For most of human history, survival depended on speed. If you encountered a snake, you didn't have time to analyze whether it was poisonous. You simply felt fear and reacted. That emotional reaction was a fast, effective guide. The problem arises when the same instinct shapes modern decisions, where the stakes are more complex and the risks less obvious. The affect. Heuristic explains why people often overestimate risks that feel scary, like airplane crashes or shark attacks, while underestimating risks that feel familiar, like car accidents or unhealthy diets. Statistically, the latter are far more dangerous, but they don't spark strong emotions. In other words, our feelings distort reality. If something feels good, we assume it's safe or beneficial. If something feels bad, we assume. The effect heuristic also helps explain polarization in society. Political decisions, for instance, are rarely made by weighing facts alone. People form emotional attachments to parties, leaders, or causes. Once emotions are involved, facts are filtered through feelings. If we feel positively toward a leader, we downplay their flaws. If we feel negatively, we magnify their mistakes. In this way, emotion doesn't just influence judgment, it becomes the lens through which judgment is formed. There is also a darker side to the affect heuristic. Fear-based messaging, whether in politics, media, or marketing, manipulates emotions to shape behavior. When people feel afraid, they are more likely to make choices that prioritize safety, even if those choices are irrational. Similarly, positive emotional associations can blind us to risk. A charismatic individual may seem trustworthy simply because they make us feel good, not because they deserve trust. Yet there's wisdom in recognizing the heuristic because once we see it at work, we can pause and question it. That pause, between emotion and decision, is where awareness grows. We can ask ourselves, am I making this choice because it feels good or because it actually is good? Am I avoiding this because it's truly dangerous or just because it feels scary? By separating feelings from facts, we give ourselves the power to choose more wisely. The affect heuristic also connects to mindfulness. When we slow down and observe our feelings without immediately acting on them, we create space for rationality. We don't have to suppress emotion. Emotions are valuable signals, but we can learn to balance them with reason. For instance, fear warns us of danger, but reason clarifies whether the danger is real or imagined. Excitement motivates us toward opportunity, but reason evaluates whether it's sustainable. The best decisions often emerge, no.